All right, so thanks everybody for coming. You enjoyed the film. It was short and sweet. Ideally, you should have seen Sallow, but that is neither short.
A bit too much for screening in the morning, right?
Oh, that's it. Definitely. I'm very pleased, honored to have Lorenzo Chiesa here with us today, director of the Genoa School of Humanities, and off soon to St. Petersburg, where he's visiting professor at the European University. In recent years, he founded and directed the Center for Critical Thought at the University of Kent. He has held visiting positions at the University of New Mexico, at the Institute for Human Sciences in Naples, and the Institute of Philosophy in Bologna. In 2007, he published Summa on Lacan, Subjectivity and Otherness. And recently, there's a new book on Lacan called The Not Two, Logic and God in Lacan. Also forthcoming is The Virtual Point of Freedom, that is to say this year. He has been translated into 10 languages and is also a specialist on biopolitical thought. Editions such as The Italian Difference and Italian Thought Today. And also edited something on Lacan called Lacan and Philosophy. So we're very lucky to have him because he is well-versed in the Italian context, both on a historical, political, and theoretical level. Work on Agamben and Verno, for example. So, today we are going from Tirana to Sal.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Josh. Let me also thank the Center for Arts and Humanities and the Department of English, who is also sponsoring my visit. It's a great pleasure to be back at AUB in Beirut. Let me just say a couple of words of how I intend to organize. I think we have like 1 hour and a half presentation. But feel free to jump in if you have any question for clarification, etc. And then we have like quite longish Q&A, if I'm correct, Josh, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's time for discussion. I want to keep it quite seminarial in a sense. So as I said, if you have any questions, stop me and we can digress and then get back to the point. I will divide the presentation into more or less 3 parts. In the first part, I will say something very general about Pasolini, assuming not all of you know the character that well, and I will focus on the film we just watched, on Teorema, which was released in 1966. So it's before 1968, which is a particularly important year in European and Italian politics. I will then refer to some of Pasolini's political writings of the late 60s and early 70s, so as to create a bridge towards Salò. Salò was released in 1975, so 9 years after Teorema. I think it makes it difficult for the scholar or even just like student interested in Pasolini to account for the radical shift Pasolini seems to undergo between Teorema and Pasolini's Salò in just 9 years. Okay? So that's the overall aim of this presentation, to show what are the political ideas that underlie these 2 films and why we moved from what I would call the failed revolution. I think Teorema is, and I will have to explain that, a film about the failed revolution anticipated before 1968 as a failure, to what Pasolini himself calls anthropological genocide. So a much more apocalyptic vision, not only of the political situation in Italy, not only on the youngsters of 1968 and the young leftist, Italian leftists of 1968, but a more generally apocalyptic approach on Italian and European society and the bourgeoisie as such. So Pasolini is, I suppose, mostly known outside of Italy as a filmmaker, and that's why I decided to focus primarily on the films. He was also, and he is still especially known in Italy, as a novelist, a poet, a polemist, and a political writer. As a socio-political thinker, it could be regarded, and that's something I wrote quite extensively about, as a precursor of contemporary Italian biopolitical thought. Just take Agamben's Versace, Pasolini's political writings often revolve around the complex polysemy of the Latin term sacertas, so sacredness, but also the opposite of it, that is to say, infamous, unlivable life, cursed life, etc. Roberto Esposito, in his book on Italian theory, dedicates a whole chapter to Pasolini. So I think, like, in a sense, there is a vague, almost most of the time implicit acknowledgement on the part of the contemporary Italian political thinkers that they take Pasolini as a reference, but it's never really developed. And I tried to do that in this forthcoming book, The Virtual Point of Freedom. There is a chapter on Pasolini where I tried to link him with biopolitical thought. The seminar today will not focus on this role of Pasolini as a precursor of contemporary Italian political thought, but I think that towards the end of the presentation, the connection will emerge, and we could develop it if you wish to do so in the discussion. For the time being, let's focus on Pasolini's Teorema and Salò. As I said before, the best way, in my opinion, to understand the relation, there is a connection between the two films and difference between the two films, is to see it as a passage from, as I said before, a failed revolution, anticipated as such already in 1966, to what Pasolini calls anthropological genocide, and we'll try to see what that means as well. Now, Teorema, the first thing to say is that when Pasolini was shooting this in 1965, and then the film was released in 1966, he was also at the same time working on a novel of the same title, Teorema, and a play. So theater, literature, and cinema. And it's very clear in saying that he doesn't give precedence to either the literary work or the cinematic work, and he's trying to put together a sort of collage using different genres. This is important because especially the finale, and we'll return to it, is slightly different. The finale of Teorema in the novel is slightly different from the finale in the film. To lay my cards on the table, I'll say that Teorema is the work, so I don't even say film, you have to take together the film, the novel, and the play, that best encapsulates Pasolini's socio-political views on the Italy of the late 50s and the 60s. Years in which Italy, and we brought it up here, the horizon, emerged as a country as one of the most advanced world economies, the fifth or sixth most advanced world economy at that point, after the so-called economic boom of the 50s and the reconstruction following World War II. Okay, so Italy was basically a non-industrialized country before World War II, partially with fascism. It became one of the most advanced capitalist economies, and it's a matter of debate for historians, but some suggest in the course of like 8 or 10 years. And Pasolini, as many other Italian intellectuals, are fascinated by what the economic boom entailed in terms of changes of culture, of morality, etc. Now, more to the point, the film, this is my personal take on it, but most of what I will say is based on Pasolini's own interviews and short writings on the film, so I try to be as faithful as possible to what he says. My take, following what he says about it, is that Teorema, that's my basic point, is a brutal assessment of the Italian bourgeoisie at the time of advanced capitalism, and especially of the new generation of young bourgeois who would go on to be, in 2 years, the protagonists of the students' protests of 1968, which were particularly strong in Italy. Teorema's message is politically very straightforward. And I think it goes as follows. The bourgeoisie is unredeemable. And he says it very explicitly in the novel. Here it's much more nuanced. The bourgeoisie is, as such as a class, unredeemable, even if, and especially when, it claims to be liberal, if not revolutionary. So, in a sense, this is a film about the fake emancipation of a bourgeois family and its deadlocks. And that will be the focus, one of the main focuses of my presentation. But let's take a step back first and look at the bigger picture. What are the main political concerns of the left, the Italian left, the European left, and especially far left of the 1960s, as seen by Pasolini, but not only by Pasolini? And I think we could summarize, and this is really, really general, historically and socially speaking, but I think we could summarize that by means of three questions. The first question is, can we overcome the bourgeoisie, and how can we overcome the bourgeoisie and its culture? A culture that looked to leftist intellectuals of those years in Italy as dominated in a new way, in a very, very rapid manner, society change in Italy. A culture dominated by consumerism, individualism, and moral decadence. The second question, which is particularly important for Pasolini, but not only for him, think about the so-called sexual emancipation of the 60s in Western Europe. Given the first question, i.e., can we overcome the bourgeoisie and its culture, and if so, how? Then the second related question is, what about sexuality? How can we approach sexuality in a new, non-bourgeois manner? And then the third question, which is possibly a more Pasolinian question, but without which you don't understand the film, which also put him into troubles with other Italian Marxists or leftists in general, has to do with religion and sacredness. Is there still place for religion and sacredness in this new context, i.e. a context that thinks the possibility of overcoming bourgeois culture and its decadence and a new approach to sexuality? So these are the three questions I think that better encapsulates the political message, or at least the political field, depicted by Teorema, which in a sense is a theorem, it is a parable. Pasolini says it very clearly. It's a parable in the gospel sense. It's a edifying, morally edifying story, but it has to do with what Pasolini's assessment of political current affairs was. So there are two layers. There's a layer which is specifically political, but it decides to tackle that by means of a parable, which is also like a theorem, and I'll return to the theorem of that parable. So let me just remind you of the plot. We just watched the film, but I think there are different ways in which to summarize the plot, and I think this is the way I would go for, especially considering what Pasolini says about the film. So we have an attractive young man who is known simply in Italian as l'ospite. I know that in various English translations of the novel, but also like a subtitling of the film, this is rendered differently. L'ospite means the guest. He's a guest. We don't know anything more about it. It's really, really clear in the novel. It's called The Guest. So we have an attractive young man, played by Terence Stamp, known simply as The Guest, who one day visits a wealthy bourgeois Milanese family. What happens? Well, he seduces, or is being seduced. That's, I think, open to debate. He seduces all the members of the family, including the maid. So the maid, the son, the mother, the daughter, and finally the father. After a couple of days, he leaves. And we know that quite possibly he will not come back. The members of the bourgeois family cannot cope with his departure. This is the least we can say. Well, the maid acquires thaumaturgical powers. She becomes a saint, in a sense. Pasolini defines in one sentence the plot as follows. He says, it's about a religious eruption in the order of a bourgeois family. And theorem of theorema, so the title, he says, has to be taken literally. This is to say, it is about an hypothesis. The parable is telling is an hypothesis. An hypothesis revolving around a question. And I'm quoting now. He says, if a bourgeois family nowadays were to be visited by a young god, whatever kind of god, he goes on to say, Dionysus, Jehovah, Jesus, what would happen? What would happen if this were to happen? That is to say, what would happen if a bourgeois family today, in 1965-66, were to be visited by a guest? He also refers to as a god, but I think this has to be then discussed, because I think the religious component is important politically speaking, but at the same time it works as an allegory. It's not to be taken literally. And I think when Pasolini specifies it's not a specific god or specific religion, he is trying to convey this point, is to say religion has a quite ambiguous role here, and can return to that. As I will argue later, another way to approach what the guest is to call it, or call him, an event, in a loosely but Bayesian sense. And I think if we bear in mind that what Turn Stamp stands for is an event, then a lot of what Pasolini, without Badiou, is trying to say politically makes sense. Let me give you some more background about the socio-historical context in which the film was made, so as to clarify the cultural and political message Pasolini intends to convey with it. So, we are in 1966, but I take the film as already anticipating 1968. Of course, 1968 is the year of the student protests, but Italian society was already, in a sense, ripe with protests, at least starting from 1964. 1964-1968 marks a profound break in Italian society. These are the years of the students' protests in school and universities. Even after the end of the protests in 1969-1970, a long period of social struggles followed in Italy. A period of emancipatory social struggles which acquired quite concrete results that lasted until at least 1974-1975. This gives you also like a way to locate Salò then. Social struggles that started with the student protests, but then involved also factory workers and a wide section of progressive Italian society. We could ask also the question, what were then the concrete emancipatory results of those widespread social struggles? Well, these are the years in which Italians vote for the legalization of divorce, abortion, equal rights for women, and then I would say like workers' rights. Italy still has like one of the most advanced policies on worker rights, redundancy, etc. Europe, they are trying to change it, of course, but it's still quite advanced in comparison with, let's say, with the US or the UK. And then this culminated in 1978 with the closure of asylums, which is still one of the few cases in the world. Italy has closed asylums for good at the end of the 70s, and there's a whole other debate about whether this is actually working, whether this does not actually incentivize the privatization of mental health care. But this is just to tell you that the protests of the 60s led in practice to some concrete social achievements and progressive achievements, which of course, and this will be the topic of Salò, Pasolini does not see as such. But let's stick to the 60s for the time being. Now, focusing more on the students' protest, why, we could ask, is there a protest not only in Italy, in a sense like the student protest in Italy is quite contiguous to the more famous protest in France, but the reason why there is a protest is because, well, there is a new generation that now goes by the name of baby boomers. I think like they would not have recognized themselves as such in those years. A new generation of people born after World War II in Western Europe, and specifically in France and Italy, who question and oppose the new capitalistic values that emerged with the economic boom of the 50s. Values which, as I said before, entail primarily quite sudden embracing of individualism and consumerism, which were not so present in fascist Italy, for instance. And yet, throughout the 30s, also the preservation, and this is very clear in the film, of a very traditional patriarchal family, basically sustained through Catholic values. So there is a quite evident clash, and that clash is not evident only to radicals like Pasolini. Think of Fellini's films of the 50s and early 60s. For Fellini, it's clear that there is a kind of like relic of the old cultural values, more or less hypocritically displayed, which revolve around an endorsement of Catholicism, but there is also something new, which is actually the consequence of a very sudden industrialization and embracing of capitalistic values. Okay. Now, what do the protesters want? Simplifying to say that they think that a new, better society is still possible, but only if the new capitalistic values, used at least in a country like backward country up until the 50s, like Italy, if these new capitalistic values are wiped out by means of a revolution. They want a revolution. Telema, the film, but also the novel and the play, must be understood in this context. Yet, Pasolini takes a very harsh stance, and now we are getting closer to an interpretation of the film itself, the political message of the film. Pasolini takes a very harsh stance on the new generation, the new student protesters. A stance which actually isolated him from not only the Communist Party, but also from other idiosyncratic Marxist intellectuals of the time. So my point here is to say that Pasolini's stance on 68 and the new generation of alleged leftists is very unique, and it was very difficult for him to actually support this stance because he was inevitably attacked. What is this stance? I think in this sense there is a poem manifesto which is called the PCE. PCE is an acronym for Italian Communist Party. The Italian Communist Party to the Young. This poem manifesto is called the Italian Communist Party to the Young, and it's ironic actually. Which was written in 1968 as a response to the major battle between the student protesters and the police, the so-called Battle of Valle Giulia. So this is like it's a bit like the corresponding event to the riots in Paris in the same year. So what is Pasolini's stance? And I think my exegetical point is that even though he wrote this only after the events of 68 in this poem, he was anticipating what would have happened in 68 already in 66 in this film. And then it's a matter of actually unfolding how this film makes the same point and in what way it makes the same point. So on the one hand, Pasolini says, obviously, I agree with you, I support you, talking to the young, would like to actually not only start a revolution, but also overcome the traditional Italian Communist Party or take it for themselves. So he says, obviously, and I paraphrase closely here, it's a pity because the poem is quite beautiful in Italian. I try to translate it, and it becomes basically just a narrative, but bear this in mind. It's a poem that was published on Italian newspaper, the Corriere della Sera. So it's like the New York Times in Italy. reacting to events that happened two days before. So that also gives like a peculiar approach to the, quite strong idea, quite strong sense of the peculiar approach that Pasolini as an intellectual had to current affairs and the political situation. So you're talking from an isolated stance, you're writing a poem to support on the one hand the students, but also dissociate yourself from them, and you're able to publish it on a major daily newspaper. I mean, this is like quite difficult to believe today, right? So he says, of course, I mean, police is a state institution, and we're together against the police. Yes, on the other hand, more importantly, and now I get, this is a translation just prepared of the poem, and I think it shows you what I was saying before much better than a lot of words, is to say the way in which Pasolini takes a harsh stance on the protesters. Quote, when yesterday at Valle Giulia, so there have been clashes and injured people, I think a couple of people died, a couple of policemen. When yesterday at Valle Giulia you fought with policemen, I sympathize with the policemen, because policemen are children of the poor. First passage. Second passage. The boys of the police, the boys of the police, whom with the holy hooliganism of rich kids you have beaten up yesterday, belong to the other social class. Yesterday at Valle Giulia, we witnessed a fragment of class struggle. And you, my dears, although you were in the right, theoretically, were the rich, while the policemen who were in the wrong, theoretically, were the poor. What a nice victory, my dears. In these cases, dears, one should give flowers to policemen. Another passage. Quote, now the journalists around the world, including those of the television, lick your asses, as one still says in inner frat boys jargon, and you say, I do not, my dears. You have the faces of rich kids. I hate you as much as I hate your fathers. Blood never lies. You have the same evil eye. You are fearful, uncertain, desperate. Think of Pietro here, because I think Pietro is precisely the epitome of what Pasolini despises. Pietro, the boy in the family. You're fearful, uncertain, desperate, very well, but you also know how to be overbearing, blackmailers, confident, and even insolent. These are all petit bourgeois prerogatives, my dears. You can see how, this was an isolated stance, because even like the old guard of the Communist Party, although they were condemning the violence, they tried to actually co-opt the student protests for their own political purposes. This is like, it's a harsher condemnation than a condemnation you could have from a right-wing liberal observer or opinionist. Now, so why does Pasolini condemn the young protesters and the '68 generation? He condemns them basically, and we're getting closer to the film, for remaining individualistic, like their fathers, in spite of their Protestant emancipation. And I think this is a key to understand Teorema as a parable. The point is like there is no way one can think of an individualistic revolution. How does Teorema fit in here as a parable? Let's approach this by asking yet another question. How do the bourgeois members of the family, especially the youngsters, Pietro, as the symbol maybe of 1968, but also Odetta, who is in a sense like close to what Pasolini calls the nihilistic side of 1968. How do the bourgeois members of the family, especially the youngster, in Teorema, react to what is very clearly depicted as the destruction of their certainties? Remember, all the characters say that. You guessed, destroyed my certainties and you left me with a void. This is the kind of reproach they all make. You destroyed my certainties, I no longer who I am, and now you're leaving me. So So after being visited by the guest, after this event, I think it's helpful to call it an event, all the protagonists lose their bourgeois identity. Better, and this is also a very significant, obsessively recurrent term, especially in the novel, better, they realize that their bourgeois identity is marked by a vuoto, a void, literally. They realize that their bourgeois identity is marked by a void, a form of impotence and meaninglessness. Yet, this awareness, and I think this is, again, the basic political message of the film, this awareness, the awareness of no longer having a bourgeois identity, of being marked by a void, does not allow none of them, even though in different ways, we'll have to see how they differ, this awareness does not allow them to redeem themselves. There is no salvation. This is the metaphor of the desert. We start with the desert and we end with the desert. There is no salvation. The bourgeoisie, however potentially open to giving up its identity and embracing revolution, however open it is, it nevertheless remains unredeemable. So it is not enough to emancipate oneself sexually. All members of the family do that in different ways, especially the mother. It is not enough to emancipate oneself and express oneself artistically or pseudo-artistically, like the song. It is not even enough, and this is the most difficult point to understand, I think, to acknowledge class struggle by donating your workers your own factory. This is what the father does. And I anticipate here that in a sense, for Pasolini, there is an element of partial redemption only in the only member of the family, or almost member of the family, who is not a bourgeois, the maid. She's a peasant who went to the city to work as a maid. But then the problem is to understand what is wrong with the father for Pasolini. Because in a sense, like, he is giving up, literally, like St. Francis, that's a clear a reference, right? He is undressing himself of his worldly goods in the train station, right? He gives up everything. That's a direct reference to the moment in which Francis of Assisi, like, you know, he was from a noble family, rich family, gave up his goods. So this is not enough, according to Pasolini. What does he himself say about this inability, intrinsic inability for the bourgeoisie to emancipate oneself, even though there is a certain degree of sexual emancipation, artistic, creative emancipation, and even a nascent acknowledgement of class struggle, but a kind of like perverted acknowledgement of class struggle on behalf of the father. Do you remember, like, at the beginning, like the journalist, this is the very first scene, asked the workers, the factory workers, if he gave you the factory, doesn't that mean that, you know, like, it totally prevents you from fighting your struggle? I think, like, the journalist there, and there's no answer. The factory workers is not saying anything, but I think, like, that's really, like, one of Pasolini's main points with regard to the father. Something else he says is that all the members of the bourgeois family, belonging to all the different generation in the film, end up, I quote, end up losing or betraying God. And he's actually writing God with, it's not a capitalized God. And I think it's quite significant. So we don't necessarily have to understand God here. That's why I was proposing to call it an event, in a sense. We don't necessarily have to understand God here in a religious sense, although Pasolini was, in his own way, a Catholic, and I will problematize that later on. So let's bear in mind that whenever he says God, in a couple of instances he calls it an event, but he usually calls the guest God. Let's bear in mind that it's, for us, like, you know, 45 years later, easier to think of that as an event. So why does the family, according to Pasolini, all of them, lose or betray the event? Because he speaks about betraying. You know, they end up losing or betraying, and then he says losing and betraying God. Why do they end up losing or betraying God or the event? Because again, that was the point I anticipated before, according to Pasolini, their emancipation, whatever forms it takes, remains an individualistic, selfish form of emancipation. Let me just quote another significant passage. Pasolini, this is in the novel, Teorema, he says, the guest not only seemed to have taken away with him the lives of those who inhabited it, but also seems to have made them, the members of the family, divided. He left each of them alone with his or her own pain for the loss, and a not least painful sense of awaiting. I mean, we can say that they are all, and I'll return to this point because I think it's really crucial, they're all awaiting another event. So what is the problem with the bourgeoisie? The problem with the bourgeoisie is that, for Pasolini, I think this is really powerful in a sense, an event is not enough. An event is something that calls for another event. An event is something that calls for a grabbing event, the fist of Odetta, when she becomes comatose. Measuring an event, she does that. Taking picture, it's like a crime scene. An event is something which the bourgeoisie encounter only in a negative manner in terms of the loss of their identity and the creation of a void. But the way in which they plan wrongly to fill that void and create a new symbolic identity is by, we could say, accumulating and owning events. And Pasolini's point here is like, you cannot own an event. However, the event itself has destroyed your previous symbolic basic mappings.
Does that apply to the maid?
Sorry?
Does that apply to the maid?
No, it does not apply to the maid. The maid, you said, yeah? No, it does not. I mean, there is like a, and I will turn to that later. There is there an attempt to actually show how you have to actually welcome an event and be faithful to it. Although it's problematic. Why? Well, because actually, yeah, well, I mean, there's a nostalgia for a peasant civilization, and clearly very open, even though just hinted towards the end, alliance between a certain form of popular Catholicism with the hammer and sickle you see at the end. So, here, and that's what accounts for, like symptomatically shows Pasolini's increasing pessimism. Here, there's still a way out. There is no way out for the bourgeoisie. But we can think a way out, and I will say more about that. And in one sentence, it would be like, a way out is possible in terms of a synergy, a political synergy between fastly disappearing but still present 1966 peasant civilization, which guards a sense of religious transcendence or meaningfulness, in a sense, with a certain kind of Marxism. Which is problematic for me at least, but this is like where Pasolini stands. Now let's focus on the on what Pasolini deems very openly, especially in interviews, is major object of scorn. That is to say, Pietro, the boy, the son. Because a lot of what he says, at times even literally, about Pietro in 1966. He will say later about the real-life student protesters. Now, Pietro, like the other members of the bourgeois family, does not accept the void, the lack, the destruction of his bourgeois identity, which is brought about by the guest. He knows very well that his symbolic life is by now meaningless. He also knows that, and we turn to the moment when he starts painting, his art is, that's the first scene we have about him becoming an artist. He knows very well that his art is only an insufficient surrogate. Yet, and this is the second scene we have about his paintings, which is becoming increasingly abstract in order to do what? To do what Odetta does. Odetta measures It's like a crime scene. Takes measures where the guests are laid down and pictures. Pietro literally wants to recreate the perfection of the blue of the eyes of the guest. So again, it's a matter of like appropriation and repetition in order to own an event. There is at first an acknowledgement of the fact that his life has by now become meaningless and that his art is only an insufficient surrogate to recreate the event, yet, and this is the second scene, the second sequence of scenes about his becoming an artist, he wants to convince the others that he is a real artist. There's a fundamental hypocrisy, and he's very open about that. I quote, this is from the novel, Pietro speaking. "Everybody will have to believe that my art is not the makeshift of a prick, of an impotent. They should rather believe that my art is based on a resolute decision, unperturbed, high, almost bullying. Nobody has to know," and this is a line also in the film, "nobody has to know that a sign is only randomly successful." Again, as I said before, the ultimate aim of Pietro's art would be to portray the guest, the blue of his eyes, that is to say, to copy, to repeat the event. And he knows, he's very aware that he cannot do that. Nevertheless, he has to present it as something which is possible, and with which he identifies as an artist. So he's unable, like the others in different ways, the other members of the family, to accept the loss that follows the departure of the guest, and, more importantly, to sacrifice his individuality in the name of the fidelity to the event as a common cause. To go back to your question, I think even though problematically for me, this is what the maid does, and I will third. This is to say, there is, for Emilia, and the name refers to a region of, agricultural region of Italy. So she goes back to peasant civilization, etc. There is in Emilia a similar shattering of her identity, but at the same time, she is able to cope with the departure and this is the problematic Catholic element, to sacrifice herself for a common cause. I will say more about that. I mean, she acquires thaumaturgical powers in order to help the little kid. And then the final scene is also significant, but I'll have to say more about the final scene because it's significantly different in the film and the novel. But the basic point here, which is epitomized by Pietro's art, and his critical stance on his art, is to say his awareness of the fact that his artistic endeavor is only an insufficient surrogate for the event, yet his intention to try and deceivingly convince others that he is a real artist, that this art is per se an event. This tension in Pietro shows again that he is not able to sacrifice his individuality, post-evental individuality, for a common cause. Let me just read a couple of passages by Pasolini on, and these are mixed, I mixed them on purpose. These are mixed passages. Some refer to Pietro and some refer to real life 68 student protesters. So in one instance, he calls them subversive young kids affected by bourgeois snobbery. Another passage, all the young literati are in the end petit bourgeois, like their older brothers who are judges or their uncles who are businessmen. They're all the same, a huge single family deprived of any kind of love. Another passage, asking for power with a capital P, rather than renouncing it once and for all, the famous sacrifice, they're doing nothing less than preparing the advent for a new exterminating God. And they are already innocently marked by a swastika. he says. It's quite harsh. The bourgeoisie itself, in this way, delegates its own destruction to its degenerate sons. It is, after all, an internal struggle. So it's an internal struggle. 1968 for Pasolini is an internal struggle between two generations of the bourgeoisie. Nothing more than that.
Lorenzo, sorry.
Yes.
I don't want to be annoying by interrupting.
No, please, go ahead. No, as you see, like it's much. It lends itself to dialogue. You know,
About Pietro, towards the end, in a sense, there's a self-blinding. The last painting he does.
Yeah, it's like a random.
I mean, it could be like a pastiche, be late return to surrealism.
Yeah.
But also, is it like we have something like an Oedipal drama happening?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Is there something there to look for that detail of painting blindly?
Yes, no, it's interesting because you're right. You have like three stages. The first stage is like an acknowledgement of the impossibility of replicating the event. The second is like the overtly hypocritical stage. That is to say, I know I cannot do it, but they, the spectators, have to believe the opposite is the case. And then it's like sort of like delivering himself to sheer randomness.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe there is like an ambiguity there. Is he still embracing that totally hypocritical stance of you know, pretending that he's able to replicate the event? I think he is. I think it's the last stage, when you're describing, it's a kind of like, it shows the contradiction between the two other stages. On the one hand, I cannot do it, hence, if I do it at random, it's always the same, right? You know, if I dedicate myself to, you know, replicating realistically or abstractly the blue of the eyes of the guest, I cannot succeed. Hence, let's try and do it at random. Mm. But then, on the other hand, you know, I can also sell that as the ultimate perfection. You know, I can keep on saying what he says. Actually, nobody has to know that a sign is successful only randomly. You see, I mean, this is like an attempt at interpreting that last passage about Pietro's argument. Did you have like another?
I don't know. I'm just like inventing now. So no, if there's something Oedipal about that, blinding, in that sense, the Oedipal value is a guilt value, right? It's almost like blinding himself or siding, trying to side with the event and leaving the father. But of course, I don't want to push it too much.
No, I see your connection. I think like that randomness has to actually be related to the second stage, that is to say, when he explicitly says nobody has to know that the successful sign happens just at random. It's a sort of like exasperation of that point, which exasperates both his acknowledgement, which is a private individual acknowledgement that there is no way you can fill in the void, but also that you will never say that and share the void. You will try to actually show that that void has been totally compensated by a perfect work of art. That's my reading, but it's open to interpretation, really. Right. Let's say something more specific about Emilia, the maid from the countryside, and also about Paolo, the father. It's important here to actually say what is quite evident in terms of the names. I said before that Emilia quite openly refers to Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, which was at the time still very agricultural. So it's clear that Emilia is not a bourgeois, and she's not even a factory worker, she's not like a city worker. She actually came from the countryside, and she goes back to the countryside after the departure of the guest. Pietro and Paolo, well, this is the element of brutal self-criticism that Pasolini will develop to absurd consequences in Salò. Pier Paolo is Pietro Paolo, so it's him. You know, this is what becomes totally unbearable in Salò. If the bourgeoisie is unredeemable, I am unredeemable. This is what Pasolini seems to be saying. You know, I am a bourgeois. And this is the best I can do. I mean, show why I think the bourgeoisie is unredeemable. Pietro, so he is a bit like Pietro and a bit like Paolo, his father. That's it. I think what is important to spell out here is the difference, according to Pasolini, and I'm not really convinced about that, between Emilia's alleged success in her fidelity and faithfulness to the event and Paolo's alleged failure. Because apparently they both seem to, according to a Pasolinian logic, to sacrifice their individuality after they encounter the guest, the event, for the sake of others. Emilia becomes a saint, as we've seen, able to miraculously cure disease, and Paolo literally strips himself of his worldly possession, and the reference to St. Francis is totally intentional. And he donates his factory to the workers. Yet, Pasolini specifies very clearly in the novel that only in Emilia's case we can detect an element of political redemption. Why, then, we should ask, does Paolo, the father, fail? And remember, the other quite clear Christian reference here, bear in mind this scene, the first scene, when Paolo wakes up, he can no longer sleep, and the sun is rising. There is also reference to St. Paul. It's quite clear. I mean, the convert par excellence. You know, like clearly, Paolo's reaction to the event is for Pasolini not as bad as Odetta's, Pietro, and Lucia. You know, like there is an element there that could lead us to think that yes, the bourgeoisie is or possibly could be redeemable. And I think he renders that by this Christian echoes with the historical figure of St. Paul and his conversion to Christianity. So why, let's because this is quite problematic for me too, so I try to dissect Pasolini's points about Paolo, and there are a few sentences here and there in interviews, etc. But why does Pasolini believe that Paolo failed? Why is the bourgeoisie utterly unredeemable, even though Paolo goes very far in A, recognizing the magnitude of the event, B, recognizing the magnitude of the void is left in terms of like assumed symbolic identity, and then C, also the extent to which he actually gives up things. He donates the factory. So what is wrong there? I mean, that was a question that fascinated me. Pasolini, and here very close to what he says explicitly in some interviews, Pasolini believes that Paolo fails because the bourgeoisie, whatever it does, even in Paolo's case donating a factory to the workers, the bourgeoisie reduces by now sacredness or the event to a private code of behavior. This is like a close paraphrase. Paolo's dilemma has to do with his own private code of behavior. How should I behave? What does it mean? Well, Pasolini seems to be implying that the bourgeoisie cannot really change, generally speaking, because they reduce the event that shatters their symbolic and imaginary certainties to an individualistic moral dilemma. It's an inner struggle. I think this makes sense. I mean, I think the film is not so explicit about that. When you read this, I guess like it's quite openly portrayed in the film by Pasolini, but you need to have like also like his interviews where he explains that to make it work. Otherwise, it's not so straightforward, in my opinion, to understand why Paolo fails. So he fails because he reduces the event to a individualistic, private, moral dilemma, an inner struggle. And if you remember, like the dialogues, he says it a lot of times. Right? It's an inner struggle. He's living. He has to talk to the guest about that. So even in Paolo's case, the consequence of the encounter with the guest amounts to nothing more than a private question. What should I do? Is this right or wrong for me? Obviously, and we go back to the beginning of the film, Paolo never asks, this is important, the workers whether they wanted the factory. You see? What should I do? What is the ultimate act of sacrifice? Donating my earthly goods, even my clothes. But there is no question being asked to the factory workers. Would you like it? And interestingly, in the first scenes, they still call him, I think the translation was boss, but it's stronger than boss. Both the interviewer and the factory workers repeatedly refer to him as il vostro or il nostro padrone, so your or our master. You know, padrone is literally master. It's boss in that reality, but it's stronger than a boss. So this is the problem for Pasolini. Even though, in a sense, Paolo is the member of the family that acknowledges more openly the vastity of the event, he reduces the event to something which is lit as an individualistic moral dilemma. And that is something which prevents him from asking the others how to deal with that event together, in a sense. To give it like a common meaning. To give a common meaning out of the meaninglessness of the event. Is this clear? And I think like the fact that the class divisions are unaltered by everything that happened is really well signposted by the fact that it remains, even after the donation of the factory, your boss or our boss. The workers cannot by define refer to him as our boss. So the conclusion here about Paolo will be as follows. He's the only member of the bourgeois family who courageously achieves a complete loss of his own identity. There is no hypocritical creation, artistic creation as a sublimation for the loss of the event, as in Pietro, for instance. Yet, Paolo, nonetheless, is not redeemable, according to Pasolini, because he's unable to consider morality and the event as separate. Pasolini also says, and I'm paraphrasing closely, interestingly, he says, Paolo's donation is a religious, but in the wrong sense of the term, solution. So you see, like when he says, like God, so there's a good way for Pasolini to interpret the event as God, but also a bad religious way. So he says, like, Paolo's donation is a wrongly religious solution, which is born out of, and I quote, moral guilt, not love. Let's move on to Emilia, the maid. So Pasolini speaks of scandalous penance in terms of what happens to Emilia. It's precisely with regard to what Pasolini sees as the two approaches, the two ways of relating religion and event, that Emilia's success can be understood. So, in a way, with Paolo, you have the wrong way of putting together religion and event. With Emilia, according to Pasolini, you have a correct approach to a new sense of sacredness via the event. So Pasolini says quite openly that she's the only one who relates the guest visit to a correct sense of sacredness. She reacts to the event by means of penance and finally a suicidal form of sacrifice, even though he said like this is not death, etc., but it looks to me like a suicidal form of sacrifice. these actions are not the product of guilt, like in Paolo's case, and here I'm not really convinced. I'm trying to sell you Pasolini's understanding, because this is where I don't buy it, but I try to pinpoint the difference between Emilia and Paolo. Emilia's actions are not the product of guilt, nor Pasolini argues, again, this is difficult to follow, of a superior mystic awareness of what happened. These actions are just the sheer product of, he says, secular traditions belonging to peasant society, which new capitalism, especially advanced capitalism, is obliterating. Now, is Pasolini then really meaning that religion, and specifically Catholicism, is our only way out, an alternative to capitalistic value? Not really, even though I think he hints at that a bit too heavily, and he can be reproached for doing that. Let's follow Pasolini's argument on this question of religion and sacredness, and how he then relates it to Marxist politics, because there is a final short circuit, which you find in the final scene of the film. So, try to reconstruct his argument in 4 points and then a conclusion. And I'm relying actually on quotes, so trying to be as close as possible to his points. First point, he says, I defend sacredness because it is the part of mankind that is today the most threatened by power and the churches. So sacredness is different from, independent of both current capitalistic power and institutionalized churches. Second point, I do, however, he says, realize that this nostalgia for an idealized sacredness, which perhaps never existed, is somehow wrong, he says, irrational and traditionalist. So there is an element of self-criticism. He takes that on board. First step, he says, anyway, simply, I am allergic to this capitalist technological society, to our over-rationalized world. And hence, what am I left with, if not expressing this reflection of the past? So he seems to be saying, I'm almost obliged to look at the past and sacredness to find an alternative to the present. Putting all these 3 points together, this is sort of like sum our conclusion of his reasoning, quite problematic for me, but very important to understand the conclusion of the film. He says, the industrial society was formed in total contradiction with the previous society, which was a peasant civilization, which is represented, he says, in the film by the maid, which peasant civilization possessed immanently a feeling of sacredness. Bourgeois society has lost it, totally lost it, and with what has it substituted it? With the ideology of wealth and power. So there's also like a hint which comes out much more prominently in the political writings, that the ideology of wealth, of capitalistic wealth, is a kind of like new religion without sacredness. For the time being, he concludes, we live in a negative moment whose outcome I cannot predict. So we're already heading towards the more apocalyptic stances he has in Salò. But at the same time, in the film, in the conclusion of the film, and much more evidently so in the conclusion of the novel, there seems to be something beyond the sacrificial redemption of the maid, which, to be honest, looks pretty reactionary to me. We do get a hint at a possible positive way out. What is it? Well, it's a sort of like alliance between this understanding of sacredness as anchored to the past civilization, the rapidly vanishing past civilization, and communism, especially among city workers. What happens, if you remember, after Emilia is, well, before Emilia is buried by the old woman, we have like a shot on the communist symbol, the sickle and the hammer. Yes?
Yes, sorry for interrupting. Is her being buried in a construction site somehow significant to the killing of capitalism, like the idea that the capitalism kills sacredness in a way?
No, it is very much connected, and I just became aware of this. I knew this, but I forgot it. That the film leaves out something. I'm not sure if it's like a deliberate decision or whether we actually watch a cut, sort of like a slightly censored version. No, the fact that they are at the construction site is very significant because the novel ends as follows. After she's buried by the old woman, and she starts weeping, and she says, as she says here, basically, I'm not weeping out of sorrow. I mean, this is a new beginning, something like that. And then, of course, the tears become a lake. And in the novel, you actually have another sort of like shot, as it were, at the wall with a hammer and sickle. And then you have like a short scene whereby you see, well, you have a description of three workers, illegal workers, working on the building site, and one gets injured. The other two look around, see this fountain, sort of like of tears. They take a bucket and they give the water to the injured worker, and the injured worker is miraculously cured. So that was left out. Maybe because, I'm not sure. I mean, I now have a doubt whether this was deliberately left out or whether the version we watched cut it and edited in a different way. Maybe it was Pasolini himself who left it out because he didn't to be too explicit in a sense. You know, like this is where I'm aiming. I don't want to make it so open in a way. I just want to hint at that. No, but the construction site is quite important. Yes, this is where I would leave things with Telema, because I have much more to say. I don't know how we are doing with time, and maybe.
Oh, I won't worry about time. It's 1:50. I was thinking about Emilia, though. The other maid is also called Emilia.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe what happens in an allegorical theological mode with Emilia could happen in another mode with Emilia, the second Emilia.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems, I really like your point that Paolo fails because, right, it's easy to give away the factory because he doesn't have to deal with the factory then.
Mm-hmm.
The real challenge would have been to have a common cause with the worker, to try to build the factory into something else, to listen to the worker, to dialogue with the workers, and then to try to, right, it's easy to just give it away.
Exactly.
Because then you don't have to deal with all
It's a solution to a moral dilemma, which
Right.
is only a fake solution, because of course, like the last shot is about him screaming, you know, like
About him,
yes,
like you said. It's
yeah, but it
individual.
doesn't even solve the moral dilemma.
Right.
It's about him, but it's not even like he's not able to solve the moral dilemma by leaving aside the probably political aspect of that dilemma.
And that's a good way of understanding the melodrama, which this isn't, but it reduces everything to it reduces politics to a personal, individual decision, and thus to that final anxiety scream on his part. And everyone seems to shut down on an individual level.
It's kind of like depoliticized existentialist stance. You know?
Right.
That would be like another very blunt way of putting it. The problem Pasolini has with the character of Paolo. He clearly goes much farther than the other members of the family in terms of like acknowledging the depth of the void which the event has created as a consequence of the eradication of his basic symbolic identity.
And can I ask a question about Pietro? I love the point that it's, you know, Pier, Paolo in one, and also the church in one, right? Peter and Paul.
Yeah.
But he says, the son, the artist must present the work as if perfect, as if a sure decision, and so no one can see that the artist is an idiot.
Yeah.
I have to check the Italian and find out exactly the words at play. But we can say this about both Teorema and Salo. They're very formalist works, they're very perfect works, they resist identification, they're not teeming with life, like the trilogy of life. There's no dirt and filth like Porcile. So, and he says in I think the interview he gave us to read, that in Salo he's going back to this formalist style. He doesn't want rough edges, he doesn't want unprofessional actors, he wants them in the right place, at the right time. He wants to be more of a, more of the director as controller. So does that tie in with the self-critique, right? And then that becomes kind of abysmal because he's given us this perfect formalist work, Diorama and Salo, and both, I think, achieve perfect, works.
to show this shift to Salo, I think, there is much more to be said, and try to condense my arguments. But what we can say for certain already at this stage is that, as anticipated before, there is an element of self-criticism in Pasolini's portrayal of Pietro, of the artist. And there is also like the evidencing of a certain impasse. I'm not sure. He seems to be saying like my work itself cannot overcome a certain hypocrisy because of its formalistic aesthetics, the perfection, etc., etc. So he is acknowledging that impasse. He's acknowledging. Maybe it goes back to the other question you were asking about the final scene about his art. That is to say, like a random painting of the blue of the eyes. I think but this is the greatness of Pasolini. I mean, he's existentially himself living what he deems to be theoretically the unredeemable character of the bourgeoisie. I mean, now we are skipping to the end of Salo and the conclusions he's making about Salo in a more personal manner. He says at one point, like, Salo conveys my hatred of bodies. And at the ultimate stage, that hatred is hatred directed at my own body, Pasolini said. But we are moving towards Salo, which needs some.
Well, this is a good point to transition, then, right?
Yeah, maybe you could go on.
Yes, I mean, let me just tell you that the first part was much more based on notes, and now I have like, if you bear with me, like I would like to present something. It's quite accessible, but I will read instead of speaking, if that's fine with you, because that allows me to create the link with Salo, and then we can open up the discussion about Salo. Reggie, other question.
Well, I mean, I can wait until later if you want to start. Just a final question about Pasolini's account of the sacred, the significance of this, invocation of the sacred. Because if his, denunciation of the bourgeoisie is because of its individualism, basically it's a critique of bourgeois individualism, the identification of bourgeois ideology with individualism, and so that if communism is identified with a kind of communalism anchored in the sacred, well, first of all, this would be the reinscription of the struggle between capital and labor in terms of the internecine Christian struggle between Protestants and Catholics. Because it's the capitalism is Protestant, and he wants to reinstate again a traditional Catholic community anchored in the sacred. But this is obviously very problematic. He seems to recognize this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
because doesn't he himself know that what notion of the sacred is he invoking? Because parts of the demystification of the sacred is also integral to, advanced Catholicism.
yes.
So he can't simply,
Yes.
if you read, think of like Aquinas.
Yeah.
So what notion of...
Yeah.
So
Well, it's interesting, like one of the last collections of political writings you wrote, from which I will be drawing, was entitled Lutheran Letters. So the question would be, and that's a really good point you make, I mean, what kind of Lutheranism is the one Pasolini is identifying with? Because it's not straightforward. Clearly it's not historical Lutheranism. It doesn't hold, you know, in terms of like its, well, cult of saints, for instance, and thaumaturgical powers, etc. But it still sees its position within Catholicism as a Lutheran position, which cannot just be solved quickly as, you know, like from like internal criticism of Catholicism. I don't have any answer to that. I mean, it actually points at the open question that was sensed by him, at least.
Because, his hostility, his understandable hostility to the kind of the bourgeois, the protesters, the 68ers, he mustn't have known. It's almost, just, what is it that's interesting from the reactionary, critique of his, it's the same critique was made by reactionary traditions, word for word. These long-haired, lazy, privileged degenerates. So although there's a kind of, against these good, honest kind of, police guys, and although, I understand, I think, in a way,
no, there is a risk there.
I think his critique is right, but he must be able, there must be a conceptual core to it that allows him, and I think part of the problem is that he can't, unless he gives a positive content to communism, what distinguishes communism from communitarianism, he's got a problem.
Of course.
And
But that is like, I don't think that there is like a sufficiently developed answer to that. I mean, how do you, distinguish from his perspective communism from, right-wing or reactionary forms of community living?
Christianity.
Exactly. That is like, the Bar's construencies are very limited, and towards the end of his career and his life, at times also, quite dangerously thanatopolitical, I would say, like what he says about abortion, etc. We can discuss that later. So, for me, the interest is like in the critique, the critical part of what he says, although at the same time, it lends itself to a right-wing reading, which was not his intention.
Yes.
You have to take that into account. Yes. Yeah. So,
Can we just
shall we just open a discussion? I don't know. I don't know.
I think this is a nice way to transition. But if I can just, the wife, mother is Lucia.
Yes.
Okay, and the daughter is
Odetta, yes.
which Odysseus or Odessa Steps or.
I don't know.
All right, it's strange.
I don't have like an answer as to why he decided for those names. I mean, maybe says it somewhere. But with Pietro Paolo, it is clear. It's basically
But in
it's a self-accusation in a sense. Yeah.
in Eisenstein, isn't the whole the crisis on the Odessa Steps in the conflict? Right.
So do you think there is a connection there?
Well, because like Marxism is catatonic, right? It's sort of stuck. Or it can't, as Ray was suggesting, it can't explain itself sufficiently. It can't differentiate common cause from, is it communalism, communitarianism, reactionary, or not so reactionary? Okay, I just wanted to.
No, but it's
Work like
it's
that.
actually, if there are like three main characters whose names are very evocative, or also like explained for what they stand for, according to Pasolini, by Pasolini himself, and the others are not, then yes, I mean, I also have that curiosity, but I never figure out what they might stand for.
Do we want to keep going, or it's 2 o'clock now? Do we want to take a 5-minute break? Or do we
Let's do a short break. But I'm open to various suggestions. I mean, I have like maybe, I don't know, like 30 minutes, kind of like short paper to transition towards Salo and then say something about Salo, which is more structured than the seminar in Torneo. So
Right.
I will read it out. if you're tired and prefer just to open up the discussion, I can bring in the points in the discussion. It's really up to you.
I think Salo deserves a formalist, sadistic reading. So but we definitely need 5 minutes. So let's take 5 minutes. Okay. 5 minutes. Part 2.
Yes, no, I actually was thinking about a couple of questions, and even though I'm far from defending Pasolini's alleged solution, I mean, the synergy between return to sacredness and a new form of yet to be invented Marxism, I think the banner you used to answer Ray's question, you really say that insists on the fact that the revolution to come should renounce power. And that's an accusation he makes almost at kind of like Lombrosian physiological level against the faces of the protesters. You know, you display the same kind of emotions that your bourgeois father displayed, and you're after power, right? That would be his answer, and that would lead back to his interest for St. Paul and the foundation of a kind of like as Agamben calls it, osme as not universalism, a universalism without determination. But then we go back to a discussion we had in two of us, that is to say, that's not my kind of Marxism. I mean, there's no space for any kind of like Leninist, broadly speaking, holding to power, however that may be transitory, you see. So I'm at odds here because I see where it's going, and it would be a kind of like return to a communistic primordial Christianity in a sense. Right? Should we be happy with that? I don't think so.
Yeah, yes.
But that answers at least the question, I guess, like how does it differ from a reactionary denunciation of 68? His point would be to say that that reactionary denunciation is always made in the name of power.
Can you explain Ambrosian, St. Ambrose?
No. I would say like Lombrosian, Lombroso.
Okay.
I mean, he's like, have you ever heard of him? Like Chiesa de Lombroso. He's been rehabilitated by kind of like right-wing social Darwinism in the 50s and 60s. I mean, he had like he's a right-wing late 19th century Italian scientist who had a very complicated taxonomy of the criminal mind, in a sense. I mean, he thought he could detect from physiognomic, allegedly empirical observation, various forms of deviation. And he was not so alone. I mean, you have something like that even in the United States in the 20th century. No, but it was like a en passant.
Okay, but how did he relate?
Well,
because
because Pasolini seems to make that mistake himself at times from an alleged left wing. So this gets him even more into trouble with regard to Ray's question, because he seems to be saying that there is something almost physiologically evil and bourgeois in the facial expressions, if not, at one point he gets to speak in his unfinished novel, Petrolio, of physical deformities.
No, he says that in the Lutheran letters, that
Yes.
the race is degenerating, you can see it.
Yes.
Their ears are too big, their
Yes.
mouths are too...
But this is where this is where we approach Salo, which is even more problematic in a sense.
Okay.
So let's focus.
The documentary class, if you turn the lights on, it will raise the needs more light from the camera.
I'm photophobic, but you can try.
Just raise one of the shades in the window.
Raise, okay, yeah, naturally. Which is captured on celluloid is not that natural. I don't think we need the lights, do we?
I didn't turn them on.
How did they turn on? Is this okay, or we can put them all up?
This should have it.
Right, so I plan to speak for about like 30, 35 minutes, something like that. And if I, take a too much time, then stop me and we can open up the discussion. So what I will try to do now is to focus on Pasolini's late political writing. So we're shifting register. The political messages in the film are expressed by means of a parable, with a theorem. There are a number of writings, mostly published on daily newspapers. So Italians could read these things, like when they were first published, they were widely accessible. Where Pasolini makes points similar to the one I've made by reading, by means of reading Teorema. They are much more explicit and possibly clear. And this should help us to transition from what I call the failed revolution as depicted in Teorema to what he calls an anthropological genocide as depicted in Salò. So throughout his late writings on politics, Pasolini sketches an extremely desolate history, cultural history, political history of post-World War II Italian society. So as we've seen, he believes that after the economic boom of the 1950s, Italy entered an age of devastating consumerism, and we are in late 60s, early 70s now. This age of devastating consumerism can also be explained, according to Pasolini, to what he calls a loss of reality, the epitome of which is represented symptomatically by the cultural crisis of 1968. So the crisis of 68. Pasolini believes that during the late 1960s, and specifically with the crisis of 68, we have two kinds of what he calls subcultures openly confronting one another. One, that of the emerging late capitalist technocratic bourgeoisie, and two, that of the young people's protest. Pasolini's condemnation, as we've seen, of the events of 1968 is convoluted, but it could be reduced to a single hypothesis. And I'm quite close, paraphrasing quite closely, something he says. So the cultural elite of the new generation, so the kids of the 1968 generation, he says, began to live existentially by means of a kind of violent anti-Oedipal critique of fathers, a series of values that the same generation was not later able to define rationally. These values remained, as he emphasizes, without a name. So think again about parallelism, vaguely speaking, with Badiou. The event, but the event was not named, in a sense. These values remained without a name, and those obliged the 68 generation to adopt what he calls the technical discourse of late capitalism. Now, despite the fact that the diagnosis of society made by the 68 generation, the extremists, was, according to Pasolini, substantially correct. He says it also, like in his poem against the clashes of Valla Giulia, you were on the right side, but you belong to the wrong class. That was the argument. So despite the fact that the diagnosis of society made by the extremists was, for him, he says, substantially correct, their linguistic, in a general sense, in terms of the discourse, vulgarity was tantamount to joyfully barking and wagging the tail at the new monsters. In a sense, this consisted first and foremost, this barking and wagging the tail at the new monsters consisted first and foremost for Pasolini of an endless iteration of political commonplaces aimed at seizing and holding power. So the failed revolution of 68 ultimately, he says, contributed to the only really existing revolution. And I'm paraphrasing very closely here. What is this really existing revolution? That of the bourgeoisie that continues to transform potentially all human beings into bourgeois through the new rules of media and consumption. Now, during the 60s, so in the midst of such a cultural crisis epitomized by these two subcultures, as he calls them, in the midst of such a cultural crisis, Pasolini was initially able to identify what he calls the last vestiges of reality still in the body of the young people of the lower classes. especially the lumpenproletariat. And this was possible, he believes, insofar as the lower classes were still alien to the bourgeois culture of the ruling classes. And I think Teorema is in this sense quite ambiguous, because on the one hand you have the vitality of Angelino. Angelino is an angel, the postman. And by the way, that's Ninetto Davoli, so Pasolini's lover. On the other hand, already in Teorema, he is a mythical figure, he's an angel. He's no longer a kid from the suburbs. He is already sort of like derealized and mythologized. Let's read a passage from Pasolini. So he says, like, up until the mid-60s, more or less, the lower classes were still almost completely in possession of their physical reality and the cultural model that took from it its form. This motif, if you know other films by Pasolini, is clearly present in his first famous neo-realist films of the early 60s, Accatone, Mamma Roma, where there is like a sublime description of the lumpenproletariat. You know, you have pimps, prostitutes, and Bach as a soundtrack. So this motif clearly present in his neo-realist films of the early 60s still underlies then the historical films, the so-called trilogy of life. In them, Pasolini aimed at representing explicitly the corporality of poor people through what he deemed to be its symbol, that is, the naked body and sex. In so doing, he intended to provoke, he says quite explicitly, 3 different sections of the public, and this in order to enhance the right to expression and sexual liberalization. What are these 3 different sections of the public? He's trying to confront and provoke, in a sense. First, the conformist petit bourgeois, who he says himself were not at all provoked by his depiction of the bodies of the lumpenproletariat as a last vestige, a relic of reality, as he calls it. Second, the intellectual critics who foreclosed the political statement about bodies and sex, and thus deemed these works to be meaningless. And 3, and most importantly, he aimed at provoking what he calls the leftist moralizers, especially what he rather nicely calls the feminist vestals, who were as indignant at what they saw as, he says, the vestals of tradition, deeming these films to be basically pornographic. I'm referring especially to the, again, so-called trilogy of life, the Decameron, the Arabian Nights, and the Canterbury Tales. Now, this is the situation in the late 60s still, and Teorema is a sort of like anticipation that this model is not really working any longer. However, in his final writing, and especially in his well-known 1975, written whilst he was shooting Salon essay, Abjuration of the Trilogy of Life, Pasolini declares that he finally has come to hate all bodies. The latest Pasolini abjures his earlier work completely insofar as it asserted the innocence of the lumpenproletariat and or the exotic body as a last kind of resistance to consumerism and advanced capitalism. Pasolini now believes that the hedonistic consumerism and sexual promiscuity imposed by the new techno-fascist power of late capitalism necessarily entails what he calls an anthropological genocide. This is concomitant with a degeneration of all bodies, independently of their social classes and geographical provenance. So in a sense, the bourgeois revolution by 1975 is fully successful. This is the conclusion, if I may simplify like that Pasolini draws. He states that he doesn't regret having shot the trilogy with its eulogy of the exotic or lumpenproletariat body. Although he doesn't regret having shot it, Pasolini vocally rejects it, and he forsakes the principle that it expressed, or better, realizes that they are no longer valid. And I think here it's worth quoting his argument in full. I quote, first, 1975, so 10 years after Teorema. First, the progressive fight for expressive democratization and sexual liberalization has been brutally overcome and frustrated by the consumerist power's decision to bestow a wide and false tolerance. I still quote, second, even the reality of innocent bodies has been violated brutally, manipulated and tampered with by the consumerist power. Indeed, such violence against bodies has become the most glaring fact of a new human epoch. End of quote, and I think like this is a good passage to just hint at the fact that in a sense Pasolini can be seen as a precursor of current debates on biopolitics, at least Italian style. From this conclusion, and I'm summarizing here, Pasolini draws 5 important corollaries from these conclusions, and I'll try to synthesize these corollaries to unpack the passage we just read. So first of all, the tolerance bestowed by the new consumerist power is essentially, he says, repressive. No man was ever forced to be as conformist as a consumer, insofar as no ruling power has ever had so many possibilities, he argues, to create human models and to impose them on people by way of media. The new power thus represents, he says, a total form of fascism that is nevertheless not as yet, 1975, embodied by a specific political entity, but rather subsists in a state of anomy. And here he evokes the catacomb, the power that we hold, which will become very important for a gunman. Second corollary, the model imposed by the new capitalist power in the field of sexuality consists, he says, of a modern sexual freedom that includes, quote, the consumption of all the surplus that is considered necessary for a modern couple, end of quote. Put differently, the injunction to emancipate oneself sexually goes hand in hand with the injunction to consume the economic surplus. I mean, I don't think I'm forcing what he's saying. The neo-fascist biopolitics of late capitalism is thus first and foremost a tolerant way of controlling politically the economy. Most leftists, and this is why he was so isolated, i.e. the old intellectuals of the resistance generation against fascism, the new feminists, and the youngsters of the far-left extra-parliamentary groups, most leftists, including these groups, are unable, Pasolini argues, to acknowledge that such a change, the change in the hedonistic tolerance now granted by the new form of capitalism, such a change took place thanks to a falsification of these leftists' own liberal values, which have consequently, argues, become counterproductive. Everything I'm saying is preparing Salon, in a sense. Just to, if you have the film in mind. During the years, he argues, of the fascist regime, so from the 20s to the mid-40s, and also the later clericalism, which was very evident in Italy of the early 50s, he says it was necessary as a leftist to be lay, liberal, and utterly irrationalistic at all costs, in order effectively to resist the ruling power. But this same strategy, now, 1975, runs the risk of playing the game of the new tolerant power. For instance, and problematically, he argues, supporting the legalization of abortion implicitly entails facilitating the ideological imposition of coitum as a means with which to implement a certain political economy. This is quite far-fetched. In this context, one of Pasolini's main targets is Italo Calvino, the famous Italian novelist, who argued against Pasolini's decision to oppose the legalization of abortion and believed Pasolini had fallen prey to an irrationalist sentimentalism that tended to idealize a lost world. Third point, this pervasive status quo imposed by the new power works, Pasolini says, retroactively. Quote, today, the degeneration of bodies and sexes has assumed a retroactive value. If those who then were that, if those who then were that have today become this, and this, it means that they were already so potentially. hence even their way of being in the past is devalued by the present. Let's explain this. So this is the reason why Calvino's reproach about an irrationalist sentimentalization of a lost word doesn't work, falls short. The collapse of present culture, 1975, and the concomitant degeneration of all bodies necessarily involve the collapse of past culture and post-bodies. There is no longer, at least for Pasolini, an idealization of the past, or at least there is an awareness that it is not possible to go back in time. This also ties in well with the conclusion of Teorema and its trait of sacredness. So now Pasolini's condemnation is trans-temporal, and it is also at the same time trans-class and trans-geographical, since the lumber proletarian body of the early films and the exotic body of the trilogy were considered as an objective survival of the past. In other words, and I quote, the lower classes achieved the loss of their body with a short delay. Fourth point, and I have 5 points. The principal symptom of this anthropological genocide that caused the demise of popular culture and the derealization of the body of the lower classes, the principal symptom is neurosis, he says. Quote, a kind of society that is tolerant and permissive is the one in which neuroses are most frequent, insofar as such a society requires that all the possibility it allows be exploited. That is, it requires a desperate effort so as not to be less than everybody else in a competitiveness without limits. End of quote. Clearly, the other sort of like precursor role I see here in Pasolini, in spite of all the problems, and we can discuss that, this is really close to one of Zizek's Lacanian mantra, i.e. we live in the age of the injunction, superegoic injunction to enjoy. This is like a new form of power. So the possibilities offered by a tolerant society are both, according to Pasolini, economic and sexual. Hedonistic ideology creates the illusion that unnecessary goods as well as unconstrained sex are easily available, and those must be consumed. The frustration that follows the impossibility of enjoying this surplus causes both unhappiness and violence, especially among the lower classes. Young proletarians, those turn into, he says, miserable, neurotic erotomaniacs, who live in an aggressive environment in which the mass is criminal. Such an environment, and we get even closer to Salot, is reminiscent, he says, of Germany at the dawn of Nazism. Fifth corollary to the main thesis we exposed before, this ethical degeneration in culture is paralleled, according to Pasolini, also by a specifically aesthetic degeneration of the body. Neurosis is by definition psychosomatic, he argues, and in the Italy of 1975, ugliness reigns supreme. Besides promoting new psychological traits, neurotic traits, the anthropological genocide of popular culture created, he says, a new race. This is the point we were introducing before. Pasolini baptizes this monster, quote, somatized ideological hooliganism. For some time during the years of the economic boom, he argues, late capitalism deluded us into believing that the conquest of medicine and an improved diet were paving the way for a better human race, he says. But it was just a brief illusion, since it is now clear that the new generation is infinitely weaker, uglier, paler, and sicker than all other generations one can remember. In his political writings, Pasolini seems to understand this degeneration primarily in terms of a lack of expressiveness of the youngster's body. So he speaks of, and I quote, there's no light in their eyes, their lineaments are like the forged lineaments of automata, they do not know how to laugh or smile. Yet, and this is where it becomes even more problematic, some passages of his unfinished novel Petrolio leave no doubt that the physical ugliness of the new generation can also be objectified into specific deformities, physical deformities. So he speaks of obesity, bandy legs, being excessively short of limb, having flattened or misshapen noses, having huge mouths, and prominent teeth, and so on. I'll skip a part which is substantiated these points because I think there's much to discuss here, and get to Salò, which this previous part was trying to introduce. Now, in his revealing 1975 interview, given like a couple of weeks before being assassinated, interview with Bachmann, Pasolini brutally admits that one of the main objectives of Salò was not to humanize, i.e. to dehumanize the young victims tortured and killed by the fascist sadists. Quote, "I have not shown victims whose side the viewers could be on. In this, I'm also very true to the side. I do not believe in pity," end of quote. Pasolini's writings of the same years repeatedly return to the question of the ambiguous relationship between the torturer and the victim. Quote, "All of the torturer's intentions are suggested by the gaze of the victim," end of quote. In Petrolio even comes to the conclusion, Petrolio is the unfinished novel, he was writing at the same time he was shooting Salò. He even comes to the conclusion that there is a peculiar total passivity in the body of those who are tortured or sentenced to death, an immobile obedience of the body that almost seems to offer itself to the torturer, and those approve the latter's action. In this context, and very controversially, Pasolini even refers to the, quote, poor tiny bodies of the Jews at Dachau or Mauthausen, end of quote. Now, the question that interested me when I started working on this was the following. What does the guilty body of the victims of the film of Salò stand for? If the victims are guilty, what does that guilty body in the film stand for? What is the relation, it would be the second question, what is the relation of these victims to Nazism and the Holocaust? Pasolini openly concedes that he is not really linking the action in the film in a direct way with the Republic of Salò. As you probably know, Salò was the last fascist, but openly supported by Hitler, republic in Italy. So we are after the capitulation of Mussolini. It's the puppet state for Hitler during the Civil War in Italy in '44. Pasolini openly conceived that he's not really linking the film, the action, in a direct way with the Republic of Salò. That is right with Italy 1944-45. That his film is not directly related to the Nazi fascism of the Second World War. So what is it related to? Quite explicitly, he says that he is referring to the young people of 1975. Salò is, quote, a representation of what we have been living with in recent years, namely the regimentation imposed by the hedonistic ideology of late capitalism, end of quote. Salò, and this is just, I'm really trying to put together what he says about the film, even though it's quite counterintuitive. Salò is thus a metaphor for how contemporary Southern capitalist power imposes sex. Remember the point you made before about the tolerant position of sex. Salò is a metaphor for how contemporary Southern capitalist power imposes sex and consumerism, or better, the consumerism of sex, on young people who in the end do not disdain it. And who thus all turn, and I'm very close to an interview he gave, all turn into the victims, little sad, in order to satisfy their hedonistic demands. In other words, the young victims, that would be my reading of the film, at least my reading of what he wanted to convey with the film, the young victims' bodies are guilty of enjoying compulsory sex. With regard to the plot of Salò, if you rewatch the film, I mean, don't watch it many times, but once you read that, it becomes very evident, because there are many victims who, in a way or another, sort of seem to be saying, we are enjoying this situation. With regard to the plot, which makes it even more unbearable, with regard to the plot of Salò, we should think especially of how, by the end of the film, some of the young victims, if not most, enjoy having sex, and for this reason, become informers about the betrayals and the transgressions of the other victims. This is, of course, if you remember, particularly the case with the lesbian couple, Eva and Antinesca, who report the misdeeds of Ezio, the sort of like collaborator who turns out to be a communist, if you remember, and the black servant. Pasolini, nonetheless, refers to historical Nazi fascism because he believes that the young people of the early 1970s underwent an anthropological genocide, he says, that is comparable with a Holocaust, and out of this Holocaust, a new army of SS emerged. Thus, the new generation, especially the youngsters of the lower classes, rapidly passed from the role of victim to that of executioner. After they were forced to abandon their cultural values, their frustrated attempt to adapt to petit bourgeois schemes announced their cruelty. You know, like if you keep this in mind, the film becomes much more unbearable. This is precisely says what happened. So after they were forced, the lumpen proletariat especially, to abandon their cultural values, their frustrated attempt to adapt to petit bourgeois schemes announced their cruelty. This is what he called in political writing somatized ideological hooliganism, if you remember. This is a phrase he uses. He says also, like, this is precisely, in a sense, a repetition of what happened 50 years earlier with the SS. Any attempt to deny the possibility of a repetition in a new historical context of Nazism raised to power and of everything that followed from it, any attempt to isolate the uniqueness of the Holocaust, he argues, amounts to expressing, quote, a form of racism against Germans. Despite the fact that, so what is the question? The question is, so the film is not about historical fascism, nevertheless it is about historical fascism. You see the tension. He's making both claims at the same time. Despite the fact that the 1945 Nazism depicted in the film should be conceived as a metaphor for 1975 neo-Nazism, Pasolini resolutely also aims to historicize such a historical fantasies. Both 1944-45 and 1975 are significant years for him. 1975 is in a sense a repetition of 1945, but 1975 is clearly a more significant year than 1945, since it is quite bluntly the year of the end of history for him. Pasolini, thus, contradictorily attempts to historicize the end of history. The complete animalization, aphasic animalization of man, carried out by the politics of late capitalistic, hedonistic ideology. In so doing, he absolutizes the uniqueness of one specific moment in history and commits the very mistake he warns us against when condemning a certain interpretation of the Holocaust. So, for instance, following Zizek's critique of Agamben, one could well suggest against Pasolini that those who consider the notion of biopolitics as the culmination of the entirety of Western thought and the genocides of the 20th century as a negative teleological endpoint of the entire history of the West tacitly accept the preclusion of the very possibility of the emergence of any kind of new political subjectivity. So what is the difference between this utterly pessimistic post-Kojèvian stance, which you can find in Agamben, in Virno, in different ways, and Pasolini? Pasolini assumes it. This is the tragic aspect of it. Pasolini assumes, I mean, he would say, yes, what I'm saying is that any possibility of the emergence of any kind of new emancipatory political subjectivity is foreclosed forever. It's deliberately open endorsement of this apocalyptic view, which is present surreptitiously, more or less implicitly, in a number, I think, of other Italian biopolitical thinkers. But also, you know, like one could go back to, you know, kind of like even the radicalization of the dialectic of the Enlightenment in Adorno, right? Pasolini doesn't have a problem in saying, this is the enemy, and I'm living this in my body. However, you can, you know, disagree with him, and they do, politically, philosophically, etc. He brings this to an extreme point. And of course, like, and the coincidence that he is then assassinated 2 weeks later is also quite brutal in a way. So this impasse seems, I think, to evidence all the difficulties involved in the programmatic statement that Pasolini intended to make with Salò. So Salò, when Pasolini started to film Salò, he wanted initially to initiate a thorough rethinking of political engagement. So he says it very clearly, I mean, I'm trying to say something here. He was trying to promote a new form of activism, in his words, opposed to the late capitalist cynical recuperation of progressive liberal themes of the old left. Judging from a series of articles, and this is what doesn't work in Salò, and he admits it. Judging from a series of articles of the same period, this new activism, especially an aestheticized activism, needed to formulate, he said, first and foremost, in the fields of art and literature, a constructive notion of what he calls communicative language. So in a sense, Pasolini sees a very clear very clear tension between what he calls expressive language, which would have been the language of the naked body and innocent sex of the Nobel proletariat, and communicative language as the language of the advanced, pseudo-tolerant, fascist form of capitalism that is hegemonic by 1975. So at the beginning of Salò, the project, he seemed to still find kind of like embryonic way of opposing what is nonetheless already like an apocalyptic conclusion in the construction of a new kind of communicative language. So if neo-fascist capitalism has managed to appropriate itself the expressive language that went with the naked body and sexuality by means of a pseudo-tolerant hedonistic ideology, the only chance we have, he says, is to actually create a new notion of their own language, their communicative language. And this is why he turns to the Sad. You know, it's really far-fetched, but it doesn't get more specific than this. You know, like I'm just throwing these elements on the table. And this is why he adopts the 100 days of Sodom, he says. And I read a quote. He says, like, pure communication and infinite accumulation is in Sad substituted for expressivity. Indeed, if the first piece of information a priest asks a child to urinate in his mouth is called inexpressive, the second is already less inexpressive, and the thousand is not inexpressive at all. Inasmuch as accumulation, I keep on quoting, is also reiteration, the effect achieved by Sad is the mechanical but supremely expressive effect of litanies. So this is the last glimmer of hope when he starts the project Salò. And by the end of the project, he's actually sincere enough to admit that that doesn't work. Even this aestheticized embryonic that are resisting politically the new form of hedonistic pseudo-tolerant capitalism does not work. That was the main point I wanted to make about Salò. I think I would stop here because then, you know, we have a lot of issues to debate, and maybe like there's a couple more points I'd like to throw in the discussion.
And to summarize, what doesn't work exactly? Trying to make a new communicative language to combat techno-capitalist language?
I think like it doesn't really say what does not work, but maybe it just realizes how far-fetched the aesthetical model, which is the last vestige of political resistance, it could identify at the beginning of the project is. You know, like go back to the example. You know, like if a priest urinates in a child's mouth one time, this is like non-expressive language, but the infinite accumulation of the same scene as depicted inside himself. Then you have like a new paradigm for expressivity, and hence a form of aesthetical resistance, at least aesthetical, to the new political capitalist regime. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in the film itself. Even though the film itself, you remember, at times tries to insinuate that there is, I mean, the final scene, if you remember, we have two collaborators dancing on waltz, and you know, you can see, when you read these lesser known articles, you can see where that is sort of like being hinted at in the film, but it doesn't work. You know, you're left, when you see the final scene, after all the most brutal tortures, and that's the last quarter of the film, and you see like the two collaborators dancing a waltz, almost like mimicking Angelo, the postman, in Teorema, if not the lumpen proletariat of the films of the early 60s, you cannot find it. I know, you can watch the film 200 times, and you will never get to this message. My opinion is that. And I think he realizes that. And just to read you like a final quote, I think this is also not an interview with Bachmann, it's another interview which is more difficult to get. So he said, the interviewer asked him, so what is the message of Salò? So he acknowledges that this kind of like marginal aesthetical last bastion of resistance is not working, and he says, well, it's a film in which I show what that I live myself, this pure degradation, I mean, such general anthropological genocide in my own body. And this is almost like a testament. I mean, this is like one of the last interviews he gave, in a way.
So it's almost like...
So Salò for me is, Salò is actually a film that attempts to create in the most utterly apocalyptic, in spite of Pasolini's most apocalyptic predictions and then evaluations in 1975, starts to create a new aesthetical paradigm that would be at least marginless and before able to resist the new biopolitical capitalist power. But in the making, this project is undone itself, and I think that is what makes it, beyond all the explicit violence and degradation, what makes it so powerful and devastating. But again, as I did with Dilemma, this is my reading of the author's own reading of the films. You see, like I'm trying to put together his own reading. I'm not trying to give my reading in a way. And because as I said before, like for me, the last scene, if you do not scrutinize like very secondary interviews or short papers, the last scene is totally impossible to understand as a spectator.
I think there's, I just have 3 points before opening it up. One, you know, when they're dancing, the libertines in the last scene, as the mayhem is going on, they're all dancing together, right? All hand in hand. That's funny, right? Which is not necessarily apocalyptic. There's something funny about it. Like in Haneke, when things get really brutal, they also get very funny. Because it's so uncomfortable that you have to laugh. And then another point is that the urinating in the mouth thing, that happens in the film, right? When the Duke, the bearded gentleman sadist, makes a girl urinate in his mouth, and the look on his face can only be described as jouissance, right? And no matter how many times you watch it, it will be jouissance, and not a guilty jouissance, because, you know, no one's being hurt. This is safe, soft sadism. In that, you know, that moment that it happens. And I think I forgot my third.
The scene you're referring to is not specifically the one, I mean, it's not the very last scene. The very last scene.
No, the last one is that mayhem.
Yeah.
This is, that happens earlier.
It's actually the two young collaborators who were dancing a waltz.
Right, and they say, what's your girlfriend's name?
Something like that, yeah.
Right, so that could come into the argument that despite the mayhem, because Pasolini's Lutheran letters have this real scorn for couples, right? And they don't, even those two men dancing, they're not affirming their relationship. They are affirming this heterosexual compulsion, or this compulsory heterosexuality, that you need to consume, and you need to couple, and you need to keep consuming as a couple.
Yeah, but that is another sort of like kind of quasi-sociological assertion about sexuality made by Pasolini in those years, which does not work today. That is to say, the whole argument about tying sexuality to political economy, according to Pasolini in the 70s, does not work with homosexuality.
Could you explain today, or?
No, for Pasolini. I mean, male homosexuality is immune to that form of subsumption.
That it enables consumption
Yes.
at that point.
That is what he says. But
Okay,
clearly it doesn't make much sense today.
Yeah, because today compulsory heterosexuality has become compulsory homosexuality, heteronormatism, I think it's called. No, homonormatism. That's so confusing. Do you know what I mean? So this is where we are today, is that to be homosexual is to be a good, this is Jasbir Puar's argument, for example, it's to be a good nationalist, to get married,
This is the point.
and to consume.
Exactly.
Right.
One of very clear passages in the, I think it's in Corsair writings, Pasolini basically says, the point about the couple is being a good consumer.
Right.
And then provocatively goes as far as saying, you know, even the legalization of divorce in Italy has to be read in this manner.
Right.
But at the same time, he has that kind of like absolutely untenable stance on the fact that this works only for heterosexual couples. And homosexuality as such is not easily subsumable by consumerism, and which, I mean, you don't have to be a sociologist nowadays to say it doesn't make sense, really. I'm aware of the fact that actually the more I spoke about Pasolini, the more I'm just trying, I'm trying to actually give you what he made himself of this project, but the more I side with, well, the more I actually try to stick faithfully to what he said, the more I have to let my disagreement emerge, and that puts me in a quite difficult position. I think a powerful point about Salò, and this is something that Agamben refers to, at least in 3 instances, is this idea that, to paraphrase one of the, I think it's a judge, that pure anarchy is only possible with utter sovereign power, which is at the core of Agamben's own argument about sovereign power and all such, right? And that's a point which Pasolini insists on quite a lot in Salò.
That's a very Roman point. Think about Roman emperors who were totally anarchic. Nero, Elagabalus, Caligula. They were also totally sovereign and they had control. Oh, but this was my third point. And you know, one is in a very difficult position because it seems that in Salò he's not only justifying or allegorizing or investing in politics, there's also a deep self-hatred. That kill them all, but first kill me. And you know, if you recall that, like Tarkovsky named his journals the Martyrology, it's almost as if he's crucifying himself in his final work, or the death drive. You know, he's begging them to kill him because he did say that this will. It's beyond bourgeoisie. It's like this will just disturb them so much that they'll have no choice but to kill me. And then this becomes almost a narrative that they did kill him, right? They, whoever they are.
No, but he
But he was asking for death, right? But let's
absolutely. That's not an overstatement.
Right.
I tend to agree. I mean, in conclusion, I live in pure degradation in my own body.
Right.
I'm living the unacceptable. It's like, this is like basically last word.
So let's open it out.
Do you think there is something unfair about the genre of the narrative? So, let's say take the book by the side or the film.
Something unfair about
Like the genre.
the genre.
Yeah, so let's say
Of narrative.
the Sad's book,
Yeah.
and Pasolini's film. In a sense, the law of the genre itself requires an ending.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if we can take the potential of that aesthetic that
Mhm.
Pasolini is thinking about outside the limitation of the genre.
Yeah.
In other words, what if it is possible to extend the activity of the Sad's novel or the activity what happens in the film ad infinitum?
I live in
Does that
yeah.
allow for an aesthetic of resistance? I was wondering if the
That's
ending
really
kind
interesting.
of makes and
Because
You know what I mean?
No, I understand perfectly, because I think like this is what Pasolini actually would have endorsed, but had to acknowledge he couldn't do. I mean, for the sheer fact that he had to close the film. You know, he speaks about the infinite. I mean, how do you have like a transvaluation, if you want to put it in these terms, of pure communicative technological language into a new kind of expressivity, right? Which was what he was after. Infinite accumulation, he says, of reiterations. He speaks of the litanies. You know, but it's not random if, you know, the original novel, which Pasolini adapts, 120 days, more like 600 pages. Exactly. So I think he was after something like what you're saying, but he has to admit that it doesn't work.
So the overflowing of that aesthetic into actual human duration is impossible. It has to, it only exists in the duration.
You mean outside of the work of art?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
As a new ethics, you mean, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that means for us. So,
Yeah, but it's so vague, you see, like that, you know, like repetition ad infinitum of urination in a child's mouth. I mean, it sounds so, I'm sorry, I'm trying not to be politically correct, but it sounds so bad. I mean, do you understand my point? I mean, I think like he's losing his bearings, you know. I can see what, well, this is like the last attempt Pasolini makes to formulate some sort of lingering political resistance, which is by now only aesthetical, right?
okay.
But at the same time, he's obliged, and I think there is also here like a great amount of sincerity, he's obliged to acknowledge that it doesn't work, and it doesn't...
Sorry, simple terms. Are we capable of imagining what in our political life, outside art, what could be pissing in a child's mouth without it being missing in a child's mouth?
Exactly.
But wait, in the film it's the other way around, which is a big difference.
No,
Yeah.
The child is pissing in the Duke's mouth, which is not hurting the child at all.
But
no, but this is the whole issue, and this is the whole issue, and this is where actually he gives up and says, I cannot make the passage. I think, I mean, again, as you unfolded your point, I think like this is precisely what he was trying embryonically to do in the last years, actually months of his life. But he has to acknowledge that it doesn't work, or at least, you know, like he would have taken a swift change of orientation. You know, like the other project he was working on, and now it's being published, and it can be connected with what you're saying. The last project he was working on, apart from Petrolio, the unfinished novel, when he was assassinated, the tentative title was Porn Theo Colossal. It was either a book, to be a book, or a film or something mixed, but the title is a Porn Theo Colossal. You know, I'm not sure whether this aims at, you know, some kind of more realistic and pragmatic attempt at, you know, exporting this infinite accumulation of litanies, of Sadian litanies, into something which is not as disgusting as a Sadian context. I'm not sure. But what is certain is that, of course, maybe he would have changed his mind like 2 years later, but I doubt it, because the pessimism has been increasing for 20 years, and I don't think, I tend to sympathize with Josh's point in a sense, like he was calling for, you know, he was more than provocative. He was, when he said like I'm hating this, I'm living this generation in my own body. I mean, there's a call for active suicide there, in a way, quite existentially tragic. I'm not sure Pasolini, let me put it, I think your point is like what you would have sided with at the beginning of the Salo project. By the end of the Salo project, I'm not sure if Pasolini had not been murdered, if he would have come up with something continuing on those lines. I mean, I can easily see how we would have like produced very little after the Salo. And the same thing applies, I don't know if you know the novel Petrolio, but Petrolio reaches like, without indulging in, you know, like Calvinian sense of Italo Calvino, hyper-realist, in sense of postmodern hyper-realism, narratives, or without indulging in the experimental writings of Soler or the likes in France. What Pasolini does with Petrolio is very radical in terms of like a literary fiction. You know, like this. The whole idea is that this is a novel. So it wasn't finished, in a sense, like we know that it was not ready to be published, but it's already thought as fragments of a novel written by another, which he is editing. So there is a kind of deconstruction, radical deconstruction of the very form of the novel genre. So, I mean, we are speculating here, but I don't think that, but to sum up my point, Pasolini, one, would have been able to develop this new nascent aesthetics as delineated in Salon. And two, I'm not sure he would have been able to actually come up with something departing from that embryonic new aesthetics. I mean, there is a sheer amount of apocalyptic pessimism that goes beyond any sort of, you know, sublimation in a way.
It's actually just a follow-up about this. It isn't one way of understanding the quotes when he's about this possible paradigm. So it's the accumulation of inexpressivity, which would be, I take it he means the kind of the extreme hyperbolic intensification
Yes.
of inexpressivity, which is of meaninglessness.
Yes.
This is tied to Sade in a way because that 120 days famously has this combinatorial mathematical structure. It's all about these infinite permutations, variations, which are supposed to be intensificatory, so that you intensify. But the intensification is also annihilate sense, purpose, meaning, teleology.
Yeah.
So maybe I take it that this is part of what he was interested in.
Absolutely.
But this would be, in a way, it's interesting, the annihilation to exhibit, to show, the erasure or the annihilation of sense, meaning, significance, etc. Cannot be apocalyptic.
Absolutely.
Because apocalypse is revelatory.
Yeah.
So in a way, this is why it's a radical kind of break with a whole regime of signification. In a way, with it undermines Pasolini's own indictment of the alleged, the degradation, the whole rhetoric of degeneration. It makes it undermines his own pessimism. So it would be a point of transvaluation. But I think the reason the film works in a way, I think the reason the film succeeds is because of its formalism, because of its stringency. I mean, in a way, it already kind of anticipates this. I mean, I was unfamiliar with this quote, but it makes a lot of sense vis-a-vis the film itself, the structure of the film, the way in which the film is composed. And he's very good, I mean, in the libertines are completely passionless. I mean, that's the whole point, is that their jouissance is passionless. It's a kind of purely, so it beyond it kind of it transplants sexuality into this kind of non-human context, which has got nothing to do with, it's not that it's about reproduction, it's not about human, it's got nothing to do with human eroticism or human relations anymore.
No, I agree with basically all you said. This sort of like chronological sequence with regard to the point you made, the contradiction inherent in late Pasolini between, this infinite accumulation or iteration of inexpressivity on the one hand, annihilation of sense, and apocalypse on the other. Yes, I mean, there is that contradiction, but as you said, one thing is actually superseding or transvaluating an apocalyptic stance by means of its contradiction, i.e. the annihilation of sense as infinite accumulation. But it does the other thing. I mean, it actually, the sequence is present the other way around in him. You know, like it's the annihilation of sense side is sensed up to a certain point as a possible way out, and then in a way contradicted by his more naively apocalyptic stance. So you see what I mean?
Yes.
One could formulate, especially an aesthetics more than a politics way, before a politics here, in terms of like kind of like a sequence going from sheer apocalypses to what you call an annihilation of sense. And the same contradiction is also present in the very film. And when you read also the exchanges, the reviews of Salo are very interesting. Calvino, Ronald Barthes, among others, wrote reviews of the film. The same contradiction, I also tried to succinctly expose it in my presentation, applies to, on the one hand, a clear, interesting, and very much topical today, rejection of the end of history plus Holocaust ideological rhetoric, and on the other hand, in actually doing precisely the same mistake in the film, because what he's doing, this very intelligent criticism, is historicizing Sartre. Sartre, this is a nice historicizing Sartre. So he's historicizing something which is explicitly ahistorical in Sartre. And Barthes says, like, this is politically dangerous. But you see how, like, even in terms of like his stance vis-a-vis the end of history, ends up in the same contradiction. So on the one hand, he has this proto-Žižekian, anti-Gambanian stance against sort of like negative theology of enlightenment, right? Or, the points he makes as a victim, as he said, I was a victim of the SS, myself, Pasolini says. The point he makes about, like the Holocaust can be repeated 200 times, why could he not? Totally clashes with the idea that actually you can historicize the end of history. It's totally, and the other interesting anecdote about that, and then he has doubts about this historicization of the end of history in a conversation with the late Man Ray. And these are really minor writings. I mean, even in Italian, they're little known. So he meets Man Ray, he praises Man Ray in 75, said like he's old but so lucid. But I cannot understand, Pasolini says, why. I think he did it on purpose. I kept on speaking my best possible French, and I said Salo, 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 and Man Ray said Salo, Salo, Salo in French, like bastard, yes, swine, etc. And Pasolini has a doubt. Maybe it can be that he's not understanding. Maybe he's trying to tell me something. And so yeah. And Barthes' critique is also powerful, I think, because there is a problem in this very idea of historicizing. Not only is there a problem in taking seriously what is quite common by now in Italian contemporary leftist biopolitical thought, post-Cogenti end of history scenario, which emerges in all political thinkers, even the most radical. So not only is there a problem with that assumption, which Pasolini partly battles against and partly endorses, but then there is like the short circuit of historicizing that, like historicizing the end of history, which is what the film, in contradiction with the other aesthetical manifesto, moralic manifesto we discussed by earlier, is doing. The film is doing that as well, trying to historicize the end of history. So, as I said before, is the film about a historical fact, or is it not? So on the one hand, the point is like, no, it's not, because I'm just talking about devastating late capitalist consumerism. I'm talking about 1975, and I'm using 1945 as an excuse. Well, why 1945? It implodes, the whole project, however interesting, implodes in his hands.
Could you say a bit more? I just didn't get about his opposition to the negative theology of enlightenment. How exactly do you mean negative theology of enlightenment? And I'm not sure whose
Yes.
opposition was. Pasolini.
Yes, I mean, there is an element, there is a trend in the late political writings and even in interviews and short writings about Salon, which evidences his attempt not to ratify the Holocaust as a unique event in history. But then the same object of criticism becomes his own point, right? So he's contradicting himself. That would be my
So
understanding.
negative theology of enlightenment in that after Auschwitz poetry is impossible.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Or, I mean, not just aesthetically speaking, in terms of creating a new aesthetic of the possibility of poetry, it's also like just a, I would dare to say like a philosophy of history or post-philosophy of history, metaphysical.
Or even that God is now really far away, in that it's a negative theology. The Holocaust kills God. Because, so that would make it a negative.
Yeah, but you see, like, I'm just trying to highlight the tension there is, quite radical tension in Pasolini between two opposite poles. Because on the one hand, he's aware of that problem. He doesn't want to make that problem, that mistake, of raising that stance. On the other hand, he does it in his own way.
But isn't that the connection between 45 and 75? Is that 75 is just the return of 45 and
Exactly.
and it can go on forever now.
Exactly.
It can repeat itself.
So that would be the anti-dialectic of enlightenment point, is to say 75, this is a good point because it allows me to clarify in my own understanding of Pasolini's contradiction. So on the one hand, 75 is just the first repetition of 1944, right? And then it could be repeated again, let's say in 2016. But on the other hand, 1975 is the end of history. And I'm showing to you. You see that this is the tension in the film for me.
But then the way you suggest to move with this is the question that you asked: what are the bodies of the victims guilty of?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In a sense, because it's kind of the dehumanization of the victim leads you to so many other in here what you could do in terms of response, desire, law. I mean, the exceptionality of 45 and the first repetition ceases to be important if you take it down that route.
Exactly.
Which
No,
is-
I also like the total demonization of the victim makes sense somehow only if you embrace the end of history pole, because otherwise. Do you see my point? I mean, in a sense.
But then how does the anthropological genocide, like, what is different about this? Or how could you make this read differently, this term that he uses, rather than...
Anthropological
Yeah.
genocide is precisely what happens with the victims in Salon. I mean, Salon
Yes.
is a metaphor about what in real life would be, put simply for Pasolini, the universal, by then universal success of the bourgeois revolution. And the adoption of universal bourgeois values, which is not clearly matched economically, in a sense. Hence all the discourse about frustration and violence and hooliganism, etc., etc. But the film is, in my understanding, a film about the anthropological genocide. But it's taken not from the stance of those who have wanted it, if we want to simplify it, but of those who are the victims of it. And the victims are actually soon turning into executioners themselves. This is the whole point. But, well, point one, does one buy it, does one not buy it? Point two, how is it compatible with any form of Marxism? But point three, also, in a sense, this even within Pasolini's own stance at this stage, it makes sense only if you actually endorse the end of history temptation he has. Otherwise, I mean, as I said before, what I find more convincing about, it's difficult obviously to distinguish like a pars construens from a pars destruens. I think in terms of like the critique of pseudo tolerance and the ideological value of hedonism of late capitalism, I think he has strong points, especially if you think that these points were made more or less between AD 1969 and AD 1975. But then, apart from that, what can we really get out of this critique? I'm not sure, really. I don't think we can get much. I mean, yeah.
Have you at all considered, I mean, you probably have, I mean, reading it through, Lacan's Kant of Exad, have you, considered doing a parallel engagement with these?
No, not particularly. I think, as I said before, in a sense, there is a kind of clear connection with the motif, which is sort of like present in Lacan, but not so well delineated, and then taken up and developed by Slavoj Žižek, of basically the injunction to enjoy the new superego, the permissive, liberal, hedonistic superego is actually the ideology at its purest, etc., etc. I think that is the connection I can see. But Pasolini was a very careful reader of Marcuse, for instance. You knew Marcuse very well. So in a sense, yes, he's anticipating Žižek, but at the same time, he's also like inserting his own considerations in a long Freudian-Marxian tradition. So, to be totally honest, I think this is pretty much. I mean, I've written like I don't know, maybe up to 5-6 articles on Pasolini, but this is pretty much what is at stake in his work for me, and I clearly acknowledge the limits. What is the particularity of his work? Well, no limits, no boundaries between genres. I mean, the fact that we can, in this discussion, throw in like a film, which is possibly one of the most notorious, infamous films ever produced, and at the same time connected with dialectics, connected with philosophy and new aesthetics, etc. That I find, like, when you consider all these aspects of his work together, I find still quite astonishing. Like, I'm not sure, apart from, I repeat, like his anti-ideological parts of this truants, I'm not sure what other use one can make today from a leftist Marxist perspective of his work beyond this.
And I know you're probably tired.
No.
I think so.
Yeah.
Come on inside. Well, can we just? No, go ahead. Okay. And then we'll go back. We start back.
Okay, I don't know how I'm gonna go about my question because this complicates things for me. I'm trying to write about Salvador using Bataille, and so for me, what I find enduring about Pasolini is the fact that just as an object, his film is so difficult to watch, and I think that so what I'm trying to do with that is to look at the status of the image and claim to some extent that it is non-representational somehow. If you compare it and if you use Bataille sort of in between death and eroticism, that kind of... Now I'm all confused after today. I can't really...
No, but I got your point. It was very clear.
Okay.
So, you see like a similar stance towards thinking a non-representational image between Bataille and Pasolini, is that?
Yes, yeah. Yeah. And this is what would be enduring about Pasolini now that even today his film is like one that's, as much as it can be released or screened all over the world and we can be talking about it, there is still something that cannot be digested or, assimilated.
I see your point, yeah. Should think more about it. The possible connections with Bataille. The first thing that comes to my mind is that, in a sense, what you are like in Salò and late Pasolini in general, in terms of sacredness, be it like general vague theological category, or more specifically rooted into the supposed innocence of a specific kind of body or sexuality. I'm almost tempted to say that by by the time you finish Salò, there's no possible. There's no longer any possible positive acceptation of sacerdotes or sacredness for Pasolini. You know, like. Those bodies are just cursed, sacer in the sense of curse. They cannot. I don't see this the kind of like the dialectics, the sublimatory. I'm tempted to say the sublimatory dialectics between abjection and the sublime, which is always there in Bataille. I think there is some of that in earlier Pasolini, but this goes beyond. I'm not sure if you agree with that.
Yeah, I felt that when we were watching Teorema earlier, I thought that there were some connections there that could be made. So, yeah. So now my project's kind of
no,
destroyed.
I think like where I'm just I never really thought about that. I mean, the text that I know the best is the Crochet, and clearly in early Pasolini, even up to Teorema, and I'm just thinking about this now, so just trying to develop it in improvising it. But clearly there is an element of so-called general economy with regard to what Pasolini has in mind in terms of sacredness up to a certain point in his work. The forgetting of the sacred, in a way. I mean, the obliteration of the sacred in terms of like sheer capitalistic accumulation. I mean, this is something which is present in the Kircher. There's this beautiful passage about those who think that the general economy works like the mentality of a mechanic who changes a tire. Bataille has that. In that sense, I think that there is a quite explicit link with what we discussed in terms of sacredness as present in Teorema. But with Salò, I'm not sure. I mean, sacredness in Salò loses its sacerdoce loses its positive acceptation. I mean, it's just cursed life. And I mean, there's also the old debate about abortion and the last writings about what he calls supernumerary deaths, supernumerary lives, Pasolini, which ties in with the end of positive sacerdoce and the end of positive sacredness in Salò. I mean, there are some alarming articles written whilst he was shooting Salò, and unrelated supposedly to the film, where he does precisely what Agamben says Nazism has done with regard to their life, is to say determining its undetermination. And he has a whole kind of like a Malthusian argument about saying basically I could defend abortion only in what he calls particular circumstances, that is to say the fact that ecologically there are too many births, hence we are facing the near future. This is where, as I said before, I think like Pasolini, in the name of criticizing a very, by now, tangible new form of, well, we call it like neoliberal capitalism, and for him it's like a neo-fascist capitalism, is ending up endorsing quite overtly thanatopolitical, unintentionally thanatopolitical positions, which are quite problematic. And this whole idea of the degeneration of life, it's also like quite problematic, really.
Wally, did you?
I'm thinking again, like counterfactually, could Pasolini have continued? I remember that another filmmaker, Louis Bourgoin, early on has a film which ends with the last chapter of the Salzburg. It's called L'Âge d'Or, the L'Âge d'Or, 1930. Can I summarize it very quickly so we can have a conversation. So the
Yeah.
film is basically about the edification of civilization, which Buñuel shows as a piece of turd on which everything is built. So it's civilization is sublimation, right? And in the story, there is a heterosexual couple trying to liberate their sexuality, but they keep on failing, they fail. And towards the end, when it's like the failure is complete, the dukes of the Sade they appear, coming out of their castle, looking like Christs. And there's a scream, and one of the girls runs out, and they hold her very gently, very tenderly. They take her in, and you hear a last cry. They kill her, and they leave. It's like, so the Sade appears in Buñuel, I suppose, when the illusion of heterosexual liberation fades. Okay, right. I mean, this kind of follows the. But then Buñuel begins his career as a political filmmaker. It's kind of interesting, no? I take it seriously, right?
Yeah.
Unless it's just like a pièce d'occasion, doesn't it?
No, I see.
Yes, I think it's.
I mean, you're still thinking about this kind of like Sadian legacy
Yeah.
to be thought aesthetically. No, but quite disturbingly, I think. Well, Agamben has followed it quite clearly. I mean, if you read The Use of Bodies, which supposedly now finishes the entire Homo Sacer 20 years project, it basically says at one point there are two Desad. There's the bad Desad, I need to say, the Desad of 120 days, and then there is a Dolmanse figure in La Le Boudoir, and he comes very close to actually making an apology for what he himself calls like perversion in a non-Lacanian sense, but in a kind of like a pathological. I mean, I don't want to. Pass as a total discrediting of Agamben, but he comes very close to a eulogy of perversion.
This is just following up on all these issues, especially going back to the whole issue of sacred and the status of the sacred in Pasolini. It struck me that in Salo, at one point there's a quotation from Kosowski, and one of the things that Kosowski points out in his reading of Sade is the paradox of Sadianism is that all of Sade's protagonists want to commit a crime that will, they claim, be equivalent to the crimes of nature. Nature is both, but of course the paradox is that nature is at once the, in a way, the kind of the absolute criminal, beyond good and evil, killing without kind of, killing the weak, the vulnerable, etc., without pity or mercy, but also indifferent to the difference between good and evil, right and wrong. So nature is at once the Sadian liberty wants to, in a way, commit a crime that exterminates the difference between right and wrong. That will exterminate crime, which is impossible. This is why he can never destroy enough to actualize, to identify with nature, because nature is indifferent. And this, so in a way,
this passage is interesting where the hero says, like, let's eradicate the moon.
Yes, I would like to kind of to blot out the sun. Yes, and all of and in a way, 120 days. Yes, all of Sade's this kind of dialectic of transgression becomes incoherent because the point is that in a way, the sacred. In a way, there's one way of recuperating it after Nietzsche, and I think Bataille tries this, by identifying nature, the general economy of nature is expenditure without return. So obviously, a restricted economy is about calculation, instrumentalization, preservation. Sacredness is expenditure without return. So the accursed share, or the dialectical coincidence of the sacred and the accursed, is that what is sacred is purposelessness, kind of pure. But I think, in a way, the question about Pasolini then, isn't the crisis he faces in the film is that he's almost like he's kind of almost recognizing how his own recourse to the sacred in his critique of capitalism has lapsed.
Absolutely.
It's no longer has any attraction, because capital is nothing but this pure, monstrous indifference. Capitalism, but of course, it's not really. This is, it's the capitalism that has become kind of a second nature. So it's a kind of a second nature generated by human practices. It's a historicized second nature, which is now ushered in this monstrous indifference, this regime of indifference, the annihilation of sense within human culture and history.
Out of which one should think a new notion of sacredness.
Exactly.
And that's why, and go back to your point, the connection it makes explicit between this nascent new post-Hegelian aesthetics of endless repetition to actually form and create a new expressive language out of sheer communicative language, which he says should be in the form of litanies.
Yes.
The connection is not random there. But I think this is something which can be thought. My point is like just it stops there, and I'm not sure he would have continued thinking that after so. I mean, I think this is not, even if, first of all, you have to sympathize with the overall critique of capitalism and, like the importance of a recuperation or preservation of sacredness in whatever sense you want to understand that such as. But there is room for going beyond Salo with Salo. I see that. I'm not sure Pasolini's own work would have been able to do that. Yeah.
Well, just to think that he had written a trilogy of life, and that he wanted to follow it up with a porno, theo, colossal. And that seems to Colossus suggest, well, on one hand, you could say this is his Inferno, and so next there has to be a Purgatorio and then a Paradiso. But you could also say that, it's Roman, that he's trying to get back to a more Roman orgy, in that the problem with Sartre, the problem with Bataille, the problem with the past 2,000 years is that the body was, corrupt. Christianity made the body, who talked about the innocence of bodies? Is it Deleuze? I don't know. But it made it all corrupt, and it made it all into self-hatred, and into, this inferno of guilt. And so, porno, theo, colossal, that's the first time I've heard this, so it's captivating, would be trying to re-render bodies innocent again. Or, an orgy that's pre-Sadian. Not that the Romans weren't sadistic, that's the problem, right? Like that, what is the relation of the sacred to the sadistic? And can you get ahead of that? Or behind that?
But again, I think I cannot, this is like a stupid speculation in the sense that I don't think he would have gone down that road. It's possible to do it. And Agamben's last book, last installment on such a series, not by coincidence entitled The Use of Bodies. It's trying to think a new use of bodies. And there are a lot of references to Sartre. There is an assessment of Lake Foucault, what works, what doesn't work. Personally, I find it very, very difficult to endorse, both ethically, politically, and more philosophically or ontologically. And I think Pasolini, I'm just repeating myself, but it would have not have gone down that way. I think we're really facing a dead end, an impasse in what he's been trying to do since the 50s. Because, all the novels and the films of the 50s and early 60s are precisely concerned with recuperating the last vestiges of what he calls reality, corporeal reality, in the form of the sexuality, or even just the corporality of the proletarian. the class who had not been culturally up until that point
Right.
subsumed by the new form of capitalism.
But now that it is, some other solution is needed, right?
Yeah.
And I think Salo did do that well at the box office compared to other retro-fascist works like Night Porter. So, he wouldn't have had the budget to do his porno, Theo, Colossal. Because one thing I think is clear is that would have required a big budget.
Because if it is to be a colossal.
Yeah. Okay, so we are winding down, but we're still alive. If anybody wants to keep.
I mean, just a thought. I mean, following up on Ray's comment, because I was wondering in the Theorema, every scene there was this break where you had shots of grass or soil. They were very consistent, actually. It was almost interruptive of every moment that the guest would meet one of the.
Yeah.
Then after it, there would be a shot of grass, and soil.
In the garden. Yeah.
I was wondering what was that, and it's very interesting also to kind of just carry that through just a thought. I mean that the maid Emilia gets covered in the soil, and what she produces is like the steer. This is the while Paolo is running again, trying to also kind of throw himself on the soil, and what he brings out as a voice, this kind of scream that could be a beginning somewhere else, right? in a sense.
Okay.
I don't know, it would be just a thought. I'm just following up on the comment on nature, because I was thinking during the film, why are these shots, why are they so consistent? I mean, it's not just once or...
Yeah, in the case of Emilia, you have an evocation of certain nostalgia, which he recognizes as such and as problematic, Pasolini, of what he calls like a past peasant civilization.
Yeah.
But then also, you're right in pointing out that he also refers and applies to other characters. I was just thinking also like Lucia has sex in what is
In
like
a
a
ditch.
crew, exactly,
Yeah.
in a ditch. So, yeah.
Anyways,
Yeah.
not very elaborate.
Well, according to the internet, innocence of becoming is Nietzsche.
Sorry?
Innocence of becoming is Nietzsche,
Uh,
as opposed to the accursed share or Sadia and self-hatred or his guilt or all of these things. He's definitely not free of it, I mean, at the end. That's all.
Yeah, maybe not to just. I mean, you could also read it backwards. Now that I've seen Theorema, you could. Sometimes you could read Salo through Theorema in a sense. You don't have to follow his mode of, producing the works.
Yeah, just abjuring the abjuration itself. Yes, even though he goes against sort of like conscious chronology, himself identifies in his work. Yes.
Think of Salo as a repetition of some sort.
Yeah.
A good or a bad one is not to be decided, but depends on how you're going to read it through Theorema.
No, in terms of like a political evolution of Pasolini's film, I think I'll go as far as suggesting that for me, Theorema is the least problematic. But then, nevertheless, it's problematic in the way that Ray evidenced before, is to say, what is the kind of communism he has in mind, and how does it differ from other reactionary forms of, critique of hedonistic, pseudo-liberal capitalism that are, yes, right-wing. And that needs to be developed, and I'm not sure you can do it with Pasolini's own work. Or, yes, I mean, you can develop what I briefly mentioned as an answer after the break to Ray's point is insistence, which is also present in Theorema, on abandoning any claim to seizing or holding power. But still, I mean, it depends on how you yourself politically side with that, whether you think that is something viable and feasible.
Yeah, which is kind of the Zizekian position, right? to have no positive determination. Just
Yeah, but I think like it's a much more widespread, positioning, the leftist position. It's a radical left mantra by now.
Yes.
yeah.
Which I think is a dubious theological
Yeah.
terms. Powerlessness as the only alternative to domination, which is like that's a bad dichotomy. As if once power as such is pathologized, first of all, power becomes a master signifier. There's no differentiate. It's really bad. I think that this whole it becomes the only way to embracing power, relinquishing the embrace of power or the acquiescence, any form of acquiescence with power is, and that this is just a kind of vacuous ethics, which I think is a symptom of a series of political failures. It's a symptom of defeats, which refuses to recognize the historical determination of this defeats.
No,
That's theology.
no, we discussed that point.
And
I totally agree. Totally agree.
would you say this is masochistic as opposed to sadistic? What this apotheosis of powerlessness is good, and as power as inherently evil? To put it into the side masoch.
I'm not sure it would even be masochistic. Well, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, it can be given a positive mystical valence, as apparently in Pasolini when it's associated with love. The idea that love is the only kind of radical break with domination.
But it's clearly not in theory.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
It's clearly not, because if you want to call this encounter with the guest,
Law.
a love, this is a love that binds them back into their inability to deal with the void, as you
Exactly.
right.
So it's not real, but
As another
it's not real love. I mean, they're given
Sure,
a
so you
chance,
want to
they're
maintain
given-
another,
exactly,
yeah.
They're not able to love. That's
Sure.
another way.
That's another way to
Not
read it, which is
being
the better
faithful.
way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
totally
Yeah, you'll
agree.
agree.
Oh, and Lorenzo, can I ask you to
Sure.
clarify one thing? You said that, Salo shows the end of history to be a fact.
Mhm.
So from now on, it's over.
Mhm.
Or is the end of history perhaps to be understood as, that you're just on repeat now, which is the same as saying it's all over because now history is just repeating
Mhm.
a certain combinatorial.
Well, yeah. This is like a part of a paper I have with Pasolini. I mean, he also has this sort of anticipation of the end of history, not as apocalypse, but as sheer, let's call it like postmodern repetition.
Right.
He has that point in some writings. So yes, I mean, the question is like, can there be different forms of thinking the end of history? Not just as an apocalyptic end, but also as sheer repetition, which is as such extra-historical.
Is this traditionally or philologically Kozhev's idea of the end of history? That it's not that, it ends in a big apocalypse, that it just keeps repeating? Or, Alan Bloom's student, who I forget his name, in the 90s about the end of history. Fukuyama. That it just, the end of history means it's the post-Cold War world and all we gotta do is consume it. Okay. I'm just trying to clarify end of history.
You mean like with regard to Pasolini? With regard to Pasolini, or much more generally? Because
Well, first in general, and then in regard to
that's
Pasolini.
difficult.
Especially now, at the end of 4 hours.
No,
We don't have to worry about it, but you've only given us a hint with the whole idea of postmodern repetition is the end of history.
I mean, there is a very nice, even though again controversial, case to which this sort of like postmodern version of the end of history, if you want to call it like that, surfaces in Pasolini. It's in his critique of long hair. He had like a very strong critique of long hair. He calls it like the discourse of long hair. And it's actually I left it out of the presentation because it's actually another version of the passage from the failed revolution to anthropological genocide. So it makes hair speak and shows how basically in 3 different stages, from being a leftist discourse, that of long hair, it became a totally homogenizing, apolitical, even reactionary discourse. And in that context, he starts speaking about the new fashion, he calls it, which he associates with the 1968 generation of growing long hair, but in different manners. So he said, like, they're not all the same. Some are quoting Christ or Renaissance men. Others are quoting neo-realist hookers, etc., etc. And my understanding, it doesn't say very clearly, but I have like a short piece on that, is that he's in a sense playing this hair fashion critique as an anticipation of what will be the postmodern end of history against what he actually calls the reification of social and economical relationships in terms of universalization of the bourgeoisie. So basically, quoting hair from other ages is nothing but a vaguest attempt at veiling the by now endless exploitation of the lower classes, which have by now lost their culture, but of course they still find themselves in an economical unfavorable position, basically. But it's really funny. I don't think I have it here. I mean, it's 3 stages, and the first stage. So the first stage is like it's like this is like wearing long hair. He has the approach of a linguist there. He says like this is a discourse. You have to take it as a sign. And he sort of like also discusses Jakob sometimes, and so he says like initially it's a contestation of bourgeois values, and then it becomes too prolix as a discourse, and hair grew longer, and then the final installment is quite strong. I don't think I have it. The final stage. Oh yes, I think I have it.
It's in the paper you said you put up on the. There's a section.
Yes.
On mustaches, beards.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Sideburns.
No, then it's like the last stage. It's a piece on, written in 1972, and it talks about the trip he made to Persia. Let me just read the quote. This September, I was in the small city of Isfahan, in the heart of Persia. Persia is an underdeveloped country, as one horrendously says, but its economy is rapidly taking off, as one says in a likewise horrendous way. One night, I was walking through the main street when I saw 2 monstrous beings among all those ancient, beautiful boys, full of an ancient human dignity. They were not really cappelloni, which is the nickname for hippie in Italian, but their hair was cut in a European fashion. Long at the back, short at the front, straw-like, artificially stuck around the face, with 2 filthy tufts over the ears. What was this hair saying? It was saying, quote, "We do not belong to this mass of wretched creatures, undeveloped poor fellows who were left behind in a barbarian age. We are clerks in banks, students, sons of people who grew rich and worked in old companies. We know Europe, we have read a lot. We are bourgeois, and here is our long hair that bears witness to our international modernity for privileged people." Let's continue.
Well, this could segue well into a critique of hipsterism, but we don't have time for that. And indeed, we are out of time. It was 3:40, 55.
Sorry.
No, we have 5 minutes.
Sorry. When you're
No, it's fine. Please.
talking in representation or in his process of, like, practically? I mean,
No, for Pasolini, that has also like quite concrete implications, because if you bear in mind the division between expressive language and communicative language, for Pasolini, communicative language, and he has pieces where he, quotes Saussure and Jacobson in his own way, of course. Communicative language is no longer language. If we actually, it becomes like a kind of like biological animalic sign. So from there, he moves on to saying this is the language of technological capitalism, but it also affects concretely, and it goes to the point, it goes as far as suggesting that there's a process of becoming aphasic of the lower classes that have been by now culturally subsumed by the new form of capitalism. So no, the history could also be as a kind of like aphasic implosion of language. Again, it's totally apocalyptic, but no, what he has in mind is also something. No, he has this description about what he would call the former lumpenproletarian people who by now have become hooligans, and he says, like, look at them. They mumble, they guffle, and then they push each other. They're not confronting each other. Of course, this is a totally spurious and mythical divide, but they're not like the lumpenproletariat I used to know in Rome, where basically, of course, they were aggressively competing with each other, but it was just all a matter of like nicknaming people, insulting in an inventive way. They're just mumbling and pushing each other, it's so, yeah, I guess that for him it has some concrete, the idea of an end of history has a quite concrete, catastrophic implications. People are no longer able to invent new things with language, especially people from the lower classes. That's his assumption.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you.